My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by writing a review on iTunes or by becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Donald J. Robertson. Donald is a writer, cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, and trainer, renowned for his expertise in combining modern psychology with ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. His latest book, How to Think Like Socrates, Ancient Philosophy as a Way of Life in the Modern World, offers timeless lessons for navigating life with wisdom and resilience. So, for those of you who have been around my podcast for a while, they know that you guys know that my blogging name for the last 15 years has been Socrates. You know that I bring it in every technical interview that I do. You know that I use the so called dialectical method of investigation. And so you would understand how amazingly enthusiastic and happy I am first to have had the opportunity to read Donald's fabulous book that I recommend to everyone, but secondly, to get him on my podcast here today to talk about ancient wisdom in the time of AI. So without further ado, welcome to Singularity FM, Donald.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about our mutual hero, Socrates.
Absolutely, absolutely. But this conversation is about you. So let's imagine we meet each other on
Uh-huh.
Stoicon or some other philosophy conference like that. And I've never met you, never heard of you before. And I ask you, Donald, who is Donald J. Robertson? Can you introduce yourself in a
Yeah.
single sentence, perhaps?
Oh, well, I should. I'm Scottish for anyone who's puzzled about my accent, although I live in Canada. And I studied philosophy, trained in psychotherapy, and I've spent the last 25 years or so writing about the relationship between ancient philosophy, particularly Stoicism, and modern psychotherapy and psychology, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the leading evidence based form of modern psychotherapy.
Yeah, and of course, I love the Scottish accent personally. I was born in Bulgaria myself, but I also live in Canada, so we're actually not too far away from each other. I'm in Toronto, you're in Montreal, I
Yeah,
think, right now, right?
that's right.
Yeah, so hopefully the next interview we do on your next book will be in person because it will be worth it. But let me ask you this first and foremost, are you a cognitive behavioral scientist or are you a philosopher?
That's a really good question. Do you know, I'd like to say that I'm influenced and inspired by the fact that in the ancient world, philosophy and psychotherapy were not two separate vocations. Sometimes people say, why should we care what a bunch of old, dead, musty dudes, guys in togas and
I'm
sandals used
about
to
to say
think?
that a few minutes later.
Yeah. Why should anyone care what these guys thought? And there are several reasons, but one thing that we've lost through, I guess, in some extent, following the Industrial Revolution and the division of labor and all that kind of things, is that today psychotherapists and philosophers are two different things. They have different journals and conferences, different trainings, they're different people. But in the ancient world, first of all, I should preface this actually by going back a step and saying many people believe that psychotherapy was invented by Sigmund Freud, funnily enough, in the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century. And that's false. Like, that's simply false. Freud actually trained in psychotherapy under Charcot and the Salpêtrière in Paris and at Nancy under Bernheim. And modern psychotherapy had been around for at least 50 years or more before Freud even began studying it. But psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. Not everything is new. Like, psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. They call it the therapy of the psyche. They wrote entire books on psychopathology and psychotherapy. For example, Galen, a famous physician who was Marcus Aurelius's court physician, wrote many books. He's a prolific writer, but he wrote a book that survives today called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the soul's passions or pathology. The word for passion can also mean illness or pathology. It's where our word pathology comes from. That's really obviously a book about the diagnosis and treatment in psychotherapy, right? And it draws heavily on Stoic writings that preceded it. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote an entire book called On Therapeutics, which is lost, unfortunately. But we have a book by Seneca, the Stoic, that exists today called On Anger, which is a book about Stoic psychotherapy for anger, basically. And 90% of the advice in it and ideas in it would not shock a modern evidence based psychotherapist. They would seem very relevant today, maybe with some adjustments or some qualification. In fact, most of what Seneca writes, shockingly, like astoundingly, is probably more relevant to modern evidence based psychotherapy than most of what Freud wrote. How remarkable is that? Freud thought anxiety was caused by repressed castration anxiety. No one cares about that idea anymore. It's completely obsolete, basically. Whereas what the Stoics said is still very, very relevant. So to come back to your original question, if we can remember it, am I a philosopher or a psychotherapist? I like to say, I like to think of the two as being intertwined. And what's special about my approach is that to go back to this time when the two were interconnected. But professionally, I did a degree in philosophy. And then, interestingly, I'll tell you a little anecdote. I wanted to do my PhD in philosophy about Stoicism and psychotherapy, but I could not find a PhD supervisor
Yeah, yeah,
who knew anything about Stoicism.
yeah.
And even if I could find someone who was willing to give it a go, they didn't know anything about cognitive behavioral therapy. They knew about psychoanalysis in some philosophy departments, but they knew nothing about cognitive behavioral therapy. So although I graduated with a first-class honours degree, and everyone thought I was going to go on and do my PhD, I couldn't because nobody would supervise it. And so instead, I took all my notes that I'd already started working on for my PhD thesis and turned them into a book called The Philosophy of CBT, which I published. And that got me a career as a writer, basically. So I then pursued a clinical career rather than an academic one. And so I guess I'm primarily for a job a psychotherapist with a background in philosophy. Although these days I spend most of my time writing books.
That's wonderful. And by the way, I can empathize with your plight there because even though mine was not to such a degree, but when I was writing my master's degree thesis in the Department of Political Science, and my focus was on armed conflict, I wanted to do something new, something that hasn't been done before. So, and that was about 2006, 2007. So call it about 18, 20 years ago. And I went and I said, well, I want to write about artificial intelligence. And I was told, listen, this is in the Department of Literature because that's science fiction, and AI is really not scientific. It's only, the three laws of robotics, Isaac Asimov, all those people.
Uh-huh.
It's got nothing to do with science, and we're the wrong department. So I had to go and argue and bargain with the dean to let me write a master's degree thesis on AI, which eventually I was lucky they did agree. But
Wow.
initially I did meet considerable pushback.
Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Socrates and AI, but before we do that, I wanted to say something because the story that I just told you, it was kind of a bit of bad luck that I had, but it ended up turning into good luck in a way.
Exactly.
Because I'm much better off now, and
Wonderful.
that's one of the insights that
Yeah.
that comes from Stoic philosophy and that Socrates himself mentions. And as a psychotherapist reading the Socratic dialogues, I'm lucky enough now to be friends with many academic classicists and philosophers, but I still feel that I read the Socratic dialogues from a different perspective. And that's what emboldened me to write a book about it. I thought, I shouldn't be writing a book about Socrates. I should leave it to experts in ancient philosophy. But I thought I can contribute something because in my conversations and my exchanges with my friends who are academics, I notice things that Socrates has said in Plato and Xenophon's dialogues that they don't seem to see as important, that they almost don't even notice. I'll give you an example. In Plato's Republic, Socrates is having a conversation about tragedy. It's the highest form of Greek art. And he's talking to Plato's elder brother, Glaucon.
Glaucon, yeah.
Yeah. And Socrates says, I think the tragedies provide terrible role models. And Glaucon's like, what are you talking about, Socrates? They're masterpieces. And Socrates says, but the people in the main characters, the protagonists in the Greek tragedies, are really the cause of their own tragedy. The tragedies are, to a large extent, self-inflicted, and a wise man would not respond to tragic events in the way that characters like Oedipus, for example, do. And Glaucon says, "What on earth are you talking about, Socrates? What would the wise man do in the face of misfortune or adversity?" And Socrates says, well, he'd do four things. And he proceeds to give a bullet point list of four cognitive strategies for coping with stress or adversity. And my friends who are academics barely even notice this. But this jumps out of the page at me because I think he's talking about psychotherapy now.
You have to
And
tell us those four bullet points now. You can't just leave us
that's
there
a secret.
hanging.
I'll tell you the first three. No, I'll tell you all of them. So the first one, what made me think of it is the first one is Socrates says, well, a wise man suspends judgment about whether anything that befalls him is good or bad, because there are many reversals of fortune in life. And in fact, the Greek tragedies illustrate this. So Oedipus, marries a beautiful woman, becomes very powerful. But then it turns out that he's accidentally married his own mother. So he thinks it's tremendous good fortune, but it turns into bad fortune. Socrates' favorite example of this was that when Athens was defeated in the Peloponnesian War by the Spartans, and the Spartans put a military junta called the 30 Tyrants in control, one of the first things they did was round up all of the Democrats who had any influence, wealth, or power and execute them in order to seize their assets. And Socrates said, well, all of my friends in Athens were complaining all the time about how poor they were and how they didn't have any status in society. But now you're grateful that you were poor and had no status because all the rich and influential people were rounded up and executed by the oligarchy. So what seems like bad luck turned out actually to be in your favor, and so on. There are many examples of this in Greek culture. So Socrates says a wise man always reserves judgment until he sees how things pan out in the longer term. That's the first thing that he does. That's different from how characters in tragedies respond immediately to the fate that befalls them, and they don't wait to see what the wider implications of it might be. In modern life, we have many examples, for instance, where somebody wins the lottery. It's the worst thing that happens to them. Now they're surrounded by people trying to exploit them. Maybe they start to squander the money on drugs. It could be many people who suddenly inherit a huge fortune and say it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. And on the contrary, conversely, often when people have a relationship that breaks up, there's a divorce or a breakup or something like that, it feels like at first it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. But then often in retrospect, it might be the best thing that happened to them because they go on or usually meet someone else. It might be an even better relationship. Or people who lose their job or are made redundant often think it's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. But later, it might turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to them. In fact, most of the time, when I've spoken to people in therapy who have been made redundant, over time, it has turned out to be for the best because often it's propelled them to choose another career that's more consistent with their values or to become self-employed or something like that. Maybe tough at first, but it works out better for them in the long run. So Socrates is a wise man suspends judgment and he doesn't jump to conclusions about whether something is going to be good or bad. That's the first thing. And Glaucon's like, wow, what's the second thing? And Socrates says, well, the second thing is that a wise man realizes that misfortunes are often already painful and that to grieve excessively about them would simply to add another level of suffering unnecessarily to something that's already painful or unpleasant.
That's a
And
very
why,
Buddhist thought.
yeah, why would we want to double our suffering by grieving excessively in response to something that's already difficult or unpleasant. And Glaucon's like, okay, well, what's the third thing? And Socrates says, well, a wise man tells himself that no individual event is all important in life because it's simply one moment in a longer story. And so we need to view things as part of a bigger picture, as part of a longer narrative. This is true that when people suffer from anxiety or depression, they usually narrow their chronological focus down onto a short period of time rather than seeing it within the wider context as if it's a whole story. It would be as if you were telling someone's life story or watching a movie and you just kept replaying the scariest moment in the story rather than allowing it to play out to its natural conclusion. So Socrates says we need to look at the whole story and not take individual events and treat them as if they define the whole thing. Would be irrational. And Glaucon's like, wow, wait, what's the fourth thing, Socrates? And Socrates says, well, the fourth thing is the most important of all. And Glaucon says, well, what's that? And Socrates says, well, a wise man tells himself that to grieve excessively, to freak out, to ruminate, to worry about something, to make a big deal out of it, would be to prevent himself from doing the very thing that's most required in the face of a crisis. And Glaucon says, well, what's that, Socrates? And Socrates says that's to think calmly and clearly and solve the problem that's in front of him. Because when we freak out, we're no good at problem solving. And in a crisis, we need level headed people who are good at solving problems rationally and not people who are freaking out and panicking. So the more he panics, like the more he prevents himself from doing the very thing that it's most necessary to do in a situation like that. As I read that, and I thought, no one told me that Socrates says this stuff in Plato's Republic. When I was at university, I wish that they'd assigned me that passage to read because it might have helped me as a young guy to cope with some of the challenges that I was actually facing in life. In the ancient world, people read Socrates, they read Plato's dialogues and Xenophon's dialogues, and they took this self-improvement advice from it, this psychological advice. But now somehow, if I say Plato, you say theory of forms, like allegory of the cave and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's what people immediately think of, right? They don't think Socrates is there dishing out cognitive behavioral advice on coping strategies.
Yeah, yeah. Very well said. And we already jumped into the deep end of things. But if you allow me to guide our conversation a little bit, I want to stay zoomed out and talk a little bit more about you and philosophy in general and things like that. Then zoom in on your book. And then towards the end, again, zoom out and see what lessons we can take
That
away.
sounds great. I love nothing more than zooming in and out.
Wonderful. Great. So, So, to be clear, what was your first love? Was it philosophy or was it cognitive behavioral therapy?
Well, actually, my first love was probably comparative religion. As a young guy, I was very
Oh, wow.
interested in Hinduism and Buddhism and Christian Gnosticism and the Kabbalah and the history of occult thought and stuff like that. And then, funnily enough, it was by reading Christian scriptures that I became interested in philosophy. Here's a bit of trivia for you. Like, we'll zoom in for a second. Like, so I'll tell you something that will shake you to the core, like, and shock you, or maybe some people it will. Did you know that in the 1940s, a cache of Christian scriptures was discovered in Egypt in a place called Nag Hammadi under a big rock called the Nag Hammadi corpus of Gnostic and Hermetic early Christian scriptures? Um, and they were bound in books, codices. And one of them contains Christian scriptures, but alongside them is an excerpt from Plato's Republic. So there was a version of Christianity in the second or third century AD, which had its own Bible that included Socrates alongside Jesus. So in a parallel universe, there's a version of the Bible that has Socrates in it.
That's absolutely amazing. Was that the same one which was kind of not recognized by the church or kind of refused to be recognized? And there was one famous passage, if I remember from one of the texts, which would say something like, "Lift a stone, then you would find me.
That's right.
Split a wood, and I am there."
That's from the Gospel of Thomas. Correct. Right. And some of the scriptures were more explicitly influenced by Neoplatonic Greek philosophy,
Yep.
for example. And so that got me interested in Plato and Greek philosophy. And then I did a philosophy degree. But when I studied philosophy, I was mainly interested in Wittgenstein and Heidegger and existentialism. And so I made a wrong turn, Nicola. I began combining philosophy and psychotherapy, but I was interested in Heidegger and Freud, or I was
Wow.
interested in Jean-Paul Sartre and
Wow.
Carl Jung,
Wow.
right? So I wanted to combine existentialism with psychoanalysis because in university departments, those were kind of still popular, right? And it didn't occur to me. Stoicism was not particularly studied. It wasn't popular. It's not even part of the undergraduate curriculum normally.
Yeah.
And cognitive behavioral therapy had no impact in philosophy departments. So if I wanted to combine philosophy and psychotherapy, like the most obvious choice, or almost the only show in town, was to combine existentialism and psychoanalysis. And I tried doing that for a year or two and then decided it was just a kind of what we call in English a dog's breakfast. Like it was a mess and of no real use to anybody, man nor beast. I thought if I read enough Jean Paul Sartre, I would end up doing nothing except drinking coffee and taking lines of speed or something, or whatever he did in cafes and Paris. You know, it didn't really inspire me in what seemed like a particularly healthy direction. I thought I need something that's more like a Western Buddhism or something, you know, that's a livable philosophy of life. And it's going to have to be a bit simpler and more down to earth to be practicable. Um, and then I began studying cognitive behavioral therapy, and I realized that the pioneers of that method quote the Stoics, or they quote Epictetus, for reasons that we could go into, perhaps. But that suddenly made me change direction, and I abandoned my interest in psychoanalysis and existentialism and became more interested in Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy.
Brilliant. Love it. And speaking of the second point and the connections or comparative sort of ideas from Buddhism, lots of time when I quote on my Facebook or other social media accounts from Stoicism, someone always jumps in and says, "This is very Buddhist.
Hmm.
This is very Buddhist." And like, for example, when you were mentioning
Yeah.
Socrates' second point to Glaucon about a wise man doesn't exasperate the evil that has befallen him or whatever it may be, the injustice, etc., because he makes it worse. That's like Buddhists talk about the two arrows that come to us, and the first one, and why Buddha
Hmm.
thought that suffering is inevitable, but pain is optional.
Yeah.
No, pain is inevitable, but suffering
Suffering
is
is
optional. The
optional.
first one
Yeah.
is done to us. The second one we do to our own selves.
And Buddhist thought heavily influenced state of the art, or by which I mean modern psychotherapy over the last 20 years, roughly, has been quite heavily influenced by Buddhist meditation and Buddhist thought, which has parallels. Now, you know, someone might say, hey, did these guys ever talk to any Buddhists? You know, and generally, I think most people who study Greek philosophy would assume no, they didn't, because Persia was in the way. Like, and you know, really throughout most of the history of the ancient world, the Silk Roads through Persia were guarded so that ambassadors or travelers from the Western world couldn't get all the way to India and the Far East. But with one very notable exception, which is a guy that everybody's heard of by the name of Alexander the Great, who very quickly cut a swathe through Persia, through the Middle East, all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan and the north of India. And but what a lot of people might not know is many people know that Alexander the Great had Aristotle as a tutor, but not a lot of people know that Alexander the Great took several philosophers with him as part of his retinue. And those philosophers represented different schools of Greek philosophy. And it may well be we're told that they spoke to nobody in the Greek world knew what a Buddhist was, right? They wouldn't know a Buddhist from a hole in the ground. It didn't mean anything to them. But what they did know were naked wise men. The Greeks call them the gymnosophoi, like the naked wise men, right? And they talk about meeting naked wise men in the East on their travels. And occasionally they talk about naked wise men actually traveling to the north of Africa, maybe having come from India. Um, and so the Greeks knew of these guys, and they compared them to their philosophy. So they may have been sects of Hindus. They may have been perhaps early Buddhists or precursors of Buddhists, and it may be. We'll never know for sure, but there was some interaction, largely thanks to Alexander the Great, between the Far East and the West, and it may be there was some mutual influence. The Buddhist scriptures contain references to a guy called King Menander, who's a Greek, ethnically Greek king, who's engaged in philosophical or theological debates with Buddhist monks. So that's a vexed question. Like, to what extent did these, completely different worlds influence each other? But some people see in certain strands of Greek philosophy elements of Eastern influence.
Wonderful. And I mean, there's also always the possibility. I mean, the Greeks were, I'm Bulgarian, so we come from sort of modern day Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the Uyghurs, which are now 1 million of them in camps in China, uh, are kind of proto Bulgarians. They were one of
Mm-hmm.
the tribes that the Bulgarians split from. And our first country was called Greater Bulgaria, is exactly in the sort of area of modern day Crimea, by the way, the
Right.
Ukraine, that's
Yeah.
now being contested by Russia and Ukraine, actually.
Yeah.
It was kind of north of Byzantium at the time in the 6th
Yeah.
century. But they came from sort of modern day Mongolia, north of
Mm-hmm.
China.
Mm-hmm.
And they came north of the Silk Road, kind of through the Eurasian landmass, if you will, rather than the
Mm-hmm.
southern part through the so-called Silk Road. And we know, by the way, the Greeks did extensive trades. Actually, their breadbasket was around the Black Sea.
Mm-hmm.
Jason and the Argonauts, all of that stuff happens in the Black Sea. So it's
Yes.
not impossible that there was another route
Yeah.
sort of north from there, and then through the trade routes
Right.
from the
Right.
Black Sea,
A back
it
door.
yes, it could have ended up in Athens, etc.
Well, I mean, there are lots of kind of little fragments and hints. It's quite tantalizing. And legends, supposedly Pythagoras had been to India. Supposedly Apollonius of Tyana, so a Neo-Pythagorean, had been to India. One of Marcus Aurelius's friends had supposedly traveled to Africa, and there he'd met gymnosophoi, like, or Indian wise men. There's even an obscure anecdote that says that a traveler from India met Socrates, which is quite surprising. And,
Wow.
if that's true, but he was a merchant from India somehow reached Athens. It's possible. It would be tricky, but it's possible. But as an aside, we also, as you know, when we speak about Greek philosophers, it's kind of that term is slightly misleading in a way, because most of them didn't actually come from modern day Greece.
Yes.
They came from the wider Greek speaking world.
Yeah.
And many coming from what we would be modern day Turkey, for example, and
Or Egypt or
Zeno,
Northern
or Egypt,
Africa.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and actually, even from Ukraine, right? So Zeno, in particular, the founder, Zeno of Citium, who came from Cyprus, like, he was the founder of Stoicism, was perceived and even denigrated, looked down on to some extent, as a foreigner. Like, he was maybe of kind of mixed heritage, because Cyprus, where he came from, was a Phoenician colony which had become, but was Greek speaking. So he's referred to as Phoenician. Like, some of his family seem to have come from modern day Lebanon. right? So we call that Greek philosophy, but maybe he was half Greek, half Phoenician, or he was a Hellenized Phoenician or something like that. But the Greeks at Athens thought he was kind of foreign, and they thought of Stoicism as a bit of a foreign, like immigrant philosophy.
Yeah, just like Anaxagoras
Yeah.
before that. Uh, that actually leads us very well to our next question, which is sort of at the general level, trying to figure out the terms that we're going to be discussing today,
Hmm.
which is a kind of a very Socratic thing.
Hmm.
What is philosophy in general, and how is Stoicism different from philosophy in general? What is Stoicism in particular?
Philosophy in general is notoriously difficult to define, but I would define it in a number of ways. One is just etymologically. The word philosophy means love of wisdom. And the Greeks took that, including the Stoics, took that quite literally, took that etymology quite seriously. Stoicism places the highest importance on virtue, on character strength, and the mother of all virtues is wisdom, Sophia. Like, so literally, Stoic ethics revolves around the idea of loving wisdom first and foremost, more than we love reputation, more than we love wealth. We should love wisdom, the Stoics say. So, for the very word philosophy, in a way, encapsulates the central principle of Stoicism. But Socrates um, and other thinkers came to call themselves philosophers in part as a reaction against another quasi philosophical movement called the Sophists. So the first famous sophist was Protagoras, who came from the generation before Socrates. He was a bit older than Socrates. And Protagoras said that there are many wise men throughout history, poets, artists, who had taught virtue to their students, but none had been bold enough to actually refer to themselves as professional wise men. And he was the first to be transparent in that regard and to say, I'm not just some educator, but I'm doing what many people have done before, under a different guise, but I'm explicitly teaching people self improvement. I'm teaching them virtue, I'm teaching them wisdom, and I'm an expert in that regard. And obviously, there's something a little bit pretentious about placing yourself in the position of an expert, a world authority. His followers called him the wisest man alive with regard to wisdom in general. Or the best. I mean, it's one thing to say that you are really good at making shoes, and it's another thing to say you know a lot about military strategy, but it's something altogether different to say you're a professional wise man. Like,
Well, both Protagoras and Anaxagoras were very smart people, whether be
yeah,
it about mathematics or physics or the sun and the moon and all those kind of natural things, or the famous Pythagorean theorem, or the harmonies in music, or what have you. But that's a little bit different than wise,
mm,
and or considerably different than wise, and that's one of sort of Socrates's main points where he kind of jumps in with his contribution. And that's one of the reasons why he
yeah,
called them also prostitutors of wisdom,
yeah.
is because they had the confidence to claim that if we know about mathematics and the sun and the moon and this and that, we also know about wisdom and justice and this and that. And
And you know what they didn't have though? The sophists. So we're talking about two traditions that preceded, that are pre-Socratic, to some extent, that precede Socrates: the sophists and the natural philosophers. And what the natural philosophers had to some extent, but the sophists generally didn't have, is the dialectical method. What's sometimes described as the question and answer method. The sophists were experts in public speaking, oratory, rhetoric. They loved to give long-winded speeches, and Socrates loved nothing more. Socrates used to pretend that he had a bad memory, and he would say, "I'm going to have to interrupt you. Can we go back to the beginning again?" Because he was smart enough to realize that often when people give very elaborate, emotive speeches, like politicians do all the time today,
yeah,
like it's often like a big smoke screen concealing some assumption that they're making, such as in the definition of a key term like democracy or equality, or it could be when people use derogatory terms like Marxist or Nazi or racist in derogatory ways. People often use these terms without defining them or clarifying the way that they're using them. And Socrates said, "What I'm really interested in is not who you think might be just or unjust, but how on earth you're defining the meaning of the word justice. You're taking it for granted that we all know what justice is already, and then waving it around and creating this smokescreen. But I'd really like to know how you're defining justice or courage or wisdom, or the other assumptions that you're making in the the key terms that you define." So that meant he had to keep interrupting sophists in order to dig down into their meaning. And that kind of annoyed them a little bit because they made a lot of money from giving speeches and they earned a lot of status. They were often very influential in Greek society. And Socrates was perceived as, in a sense, a threat to their wealth and status.
Yeah, and I've been trying to do that kind of questioning for the last 15 years with my podcast, by the way. And one interesting side note that we may get to discuss later, uh, that you may not be surprised about, is that I've spoken to some of the best experts in the world of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And every time at the beginning of each conversation, I ask them to please define what they
Yeah.
mean by the term artificial intelligence. And let me share with you, I've done 300 interviews, and at least a couple of hundreds of them have
Right.
been on the topic of AI specifically.
Uh-huh.
No two people ever so far
Interesting.
have given me the same definition of AI,
Uh-huh.
even though it's supposed to be a highly strictly scientific concept. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
things got so bad once I was moderating a panel of
Mm-hmm.
3 professors in computer science at the University of Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I start with like a basic kind of a icebreaker conversation about what is computer science all about.
Mm-hmm.
Little did I know that triggered an all-out war between the
Mm-hmm.
3 esteemed professors,
Mm-hmm.
and we never managed to move on from that question for the next 1 hour.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So even those supposedly highly specific modern scientific concepts like AI and computer science were highly debatable. So yeah, that's an interesting observation, and that's why we
Wow.
need to also ask you, what is cognitive behavioral therapy?
Oh, what is cognitive behavioral therapy? Well, you'll notice that it's got two adjectives in it. Like it's both cognitive and behavioral because these are two branches of modern psychology that, to some extent, compete with but also complement each other. So, cognitive behavioral therapy draws on cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology, and it also happens to attempt to change our voluntary cognitions or thinking, cognitions or thoughts or beliefs, and our voluntary behavior in order to thereby influence our emotions. So, cognitive behavioral therapy is the leading evidence based form of modern psychotherapy. It originated in the 1950s. It really went mainstream in the 1980s, 1990s. It's far more based on research than previous forms of psychotherapy. And we mentioned earlier that these books quote Epictetus. To a large extent, the cognitive part in particular is based on what you could call a cognitive or the cognitive theory, really a cognitive theory of emotion, which says that our beliefs and our patterns of thinking influence our emotions. And this is the key part that's usually left out to a greater extent than we normally realize, right? Otherwise, what would be the point in telling people that? Your beliefs have more influence over your emotions than you would normally realize because we don't usually pay that much attention to the interaction between our beliefs and our emotions. And so the cognitive model is based on a bunch of different research studies. Now, psychotherapists study modern research that's surprisingly technical, um, and complex and nuanced. But then we sit in a room with a bunch of random people, right, called therapy clients. And those therapy clients could be a 13-year-old kid that's been kicked out of school. They could be an elderly Jewish matriarch. They could be a man with a wooden leg that sings in a punk rock band. They could be, they could be your maiden aunt. They could be, anybody under the sun. They could be a celebrity. Like they could, they're a mixed bag of random people that come to therapy. And so we have to take these concepts from modern research and communicate them to a wide variety of different people. Uh, and usually that means we have to simplify them. And so Ellis had read the Stoics, and he said, it's a bit like this quote from Epictetus, a famous Stoic philosopher, who said, people are not upset by events, but rather by their opinions about events. And that's from the handbook or Enchiridion of Epictetus. And Ellis started to tell that quote to his clients, and he realized that they found it relatable. And he said that's pretty much in a nutshell, like what the cognitive model of emotion is saying. The Stoics said something very similar 2,500 years ago. And he taught that quote to all of his clients, all of his students. And he mentions it in most of the book, many, many books that he wrote. Until by the time I became interested in CBT in the 1990s, it was a cliche that you'd find in pretty much any book in the subject. And what surprised me, though, was that given that this is so fundamental, it describes a premise of cognitive therapy or cognitive therapy combined with behavior therapy, what we call CBT, and a premise of Stoicism. And so from such a fundamental premise, independently, CBT and Stoicism are probably going to arrive at some fairly similar conclusions to one another. So they're probably going to think, well, if that's true, like if our opinions are what upset us, we should probably try and identify what those opinions are, number one, and figure out maybe there are stereotypical opinions that cause different emotions. Like maybe there are certain types of beliefs that are associated with depression. Different types of beliefs maybe cause anger and anxiety of different sorts. And then maybe we should start asking ourselves questions, like Socratic questions about, for example, maybe I'm depressed because I think nobody likes me, everybody hates me. And maybe I'm angry because I think you've done something that you shouldn't have done and you deserve to be punished for it. And maybe I'm anxious because I think something awful is about to happen and I won't be able to cope with it. And I might be wrong about all of those things. Or I might be right to some extent, but it might not be the whole story. I might be selective in my processing of information. And so it might be helpful for me to question some of the assumptions that cause anxiety, anger, or sadness. And the Stoics did that in one way. Cognitive behavioral therapy does it in another way. It happens to do it through a technique called Socratic questioning, which is Aaron Beck, the other pioneer of cognitive therapy, had studied Plato's Republic at university, and he said this questioning approach seems like relevant to doing therapy. If we think people's beliefs are causing their emotional problems, we should probably question those beliefs. I mean, we sometimes refer to the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy because, let me put it this way, kind of colloquially, as it were. When clients turn up in therapy, they'll say, I'm very anxious, I'm very angry, or whatever. And I know it's wrong. I know it's causing me all sorts of problems. It's messing up my life. It's making me physically ill. It's interfering with my ability to perform at work. It's really upsetting my wife and kids. And it's been going on for a really, really long time, and it's just getting worse. Right? So this is like what sometimes would be called an annoyance review. These are a bunch of horrible consequences of anger, anxiety, or sadness. They're all pretty good reasons for changing it or doing something about it. But then what clients will do is express stuckness. They'll say, but I can't help it. It's just the way I feel. And Albert Ellis, the earliest pioneer of modern cognitive therapy, who had read the Stoics, would lean forward at that point. He'd smile at them and he'd say, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. Because if someone says it's just how I feel, they're kind of saying there's nothing I can do about it. What do you expect? It's just natural. It's just the way I am. I'm just anxious, right? But if it turns out you're anxious because you believe, rightly or wrongly, that something catastrophic is about to happen, you might be exaggerating the probability of that happening. You might be exaggerating the severity of it. you might be underestimating your coping ability, right? So you might be wrong on a number of levels about the beliefs. And once you realize that, you can say, where's the evidence for that? And you open up what I would describe as a toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques. Suddenly that box flies open because you can go, we can start critiquing, questioning, and evaluating and challenging the beliefs. It's no longer just how you feel. If it's also how you think, your thinking might be irrational, it might be incomplete, it might be selective, it might be mistaken, and so we can start working on that. And if those beliefs change, I wonder, is it possible that if the beliefs change, your emotions would change? Well, guess what? It turns out, after decades of research and clinical trials, that generally speaking, yeah, when your beliefs change, the associated emotions change as a consequence, broadly speaking. So the Stoics were right about that. And we have now, after 2000 years, Stoicism has been finally validated in many of its premises by research, including clinical trials and modern psychotherapy.
So in a way, that's why I've heard you say before that reason is therapy, and that's kind of like
Yeah.
perhaps the major insight we can take from the Stoics. But let me bring in here one put down that a guest on my show once brought. I had
Hmm.
Lisa Cron, who is the author of Wired for Story,
Hmm.
and she told me that Stoicism is a bunch of white men scared of their emotions.
Wow. So a couple of things about that. Number one, they weren't white. Like, so Zeno, we mentioned already, was Phoenician. We're told that he was dark skinned. So he was like ethnically, like he was came from a seafaring race. So actually he would have been darkly tanned, like as a result of being spending his life on boats in the ancient world. And he would have been Middle Eastern, right? So it's not really true to say, first of all, they're just a bunch of white men. Like the guy was Phoenician. Like that's not slightly misleading way of characterizing it. He was seen as a foreign immigrant by the Athenians. They're scared of their emotions. They want to suppress their emotions. No, this is a simple error that has been made because of the terminology. So let me give a little bit of context here. If I told you that I am an Epicurean, you might think, do you mean you're a philosopher who follows the teachings of Epicurus? Or do you just mean that you enjoy fine dining? Because when someone says today that they're an Epicurean, they often mean that they enjoy fine foods, right? If I said to you, Nicola, I'm a cynic, you might say, does that mean that you follow Diogenes and his teachings? Or do you mean that you just have a very negative, pessimistic attitude towards other people and life in general? The same is true of the words skeptic, sophist, academic, stoic. Many words associated with Greek philosophy have modern equivalents that bear very little relationship to what they originally meant and are in conflict with their original meaning. They denote schools of philosophy, but now they've just come to refer to personality traits. And so, generally, if I was talking about someone being cynical, I would spell it with a lowercase c. But if I was talking about Diogenes the cynic, I would capitalize the C.
Yeah.
So that will help you, like when you're reading books and articles, to tell immediately which we're talking about. Now, I say this because the word stoic, when it's spelled with a lowercase s, refers to somebody who suppresses or conceals unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. It means having a stiff upper lip. And that's what the lady that you're referring to was using the word to mean, right? Because that's the most common use of the word today. But it has nothing to do with the philosophy of Stoicism that was taught by Zeno, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, any more than someone who's a restaurateur and an Epicurean is a follower of the teachings of Epicurus. They're two completely unrelated things. It's the word has come to mean something different in common parlance, and that's very important because lowercase stoicism is actually the subject of a considerable amount of research in modern psychotherapy and in health research. And we have a number of converging studies from different teams of researchers in different disciplines in different parts of the world that all indicate that lowercase stoicism, which we measure using a number of different research tools, such as, for example, the Liverpool Stoicism Scale is one, is bad for your mental health for obvious reasons. So that I can tell you several reasons why. One really obvious reason is that people who suppress or conceal unpleasant or embarrassing emotions don't usually go to the doctor or go to see a psychotherapist. So lowercase stoic people don't go to therapists and counselors and stuff like that, or psychiatrists, and they don't talk to their friends and family about their emotional pain. They keep it all bottled up, right? They have a stiff upper lip. And that's like saying somebody who has a broken leg or an illness or whatever just doesn't go and seek medical help, right? They're going to fare better because if they go and see a professional who can potentially help them with the problems they're experiencing. So because lowercase stoics do not seek social support or professional support, that fact alone makes it likely that they're going to cope badly over time and exhibit less emotional resilience. Now, the irony is that lowercase stoics believe that they are tough. They believe that they're highly resilient people. But all the research shows that the opposite is true. And they're actually fragile and vulnerable individuals. They're more prone to developing depression and anxiety that's severe over the course of time. The other reason is that because they view anxiety and other unpleasant emotions negatively, that backfires. If I think, oh my God, anxiety is embarrassing, I mustn't allow other people to see that I'm anxious, that heightens self focused attention. And it tends to be like, naturally, your brain will think, so this thing's dangerous. I should pay more attention to it. So the animal primitive part of your brain automatically allocates more attention to things that you've designated as threats. Now, that's really useful if you're a small mammal, Nicola, like, on a plane, and in the distance you see a predator and you think, gee, that looks dangerous. Your brains will go, well, I better pay attention to it. If it starts moving, I better start running, right? But if you think that blushing or feeling like you're going to cry is threatening or dangerous, and your brain suddenly treats that like a predator and allocates more attention to it, guess what? It makes it worse and amplifies it. It increases cognitive load and makes you feel more confused and more awkward. And it tends to lead to a whole bunch of other problems, right? Also, we know from a number of studies that when people deliberately try to suppress uh, unpleasant feelings or thoughts, there's something that psychologists call the paradox of thought suppression or the rebound effect. So those thoughts are more likely to recur more frequently in the future. So suppressing or concealing unpleasant, embarrassing emotions for a whole bunch of reasons can easily be demonstrated to be an unhealthy psychological strategy, right? Whereas capitalist stoicism inspired cognitive therapy, and it says that rather than viewing these emotions as bad, what we should do is, first of all, distinguish between the voluntary and involuntary aspects of our emotion, which is already a lot more than people normally do, right? We should learn to accept the involuntary aspects of our emotion as indifferent and natural rather than bad and embarrassing. And we should take responsibility for the voluntary component of emotion, such as our thinking and behavior, and question whether or not it's rational. And so replace irrational beliefs with more healthy and rational ones, rather than simply trying to distract ourselves from them or suppress them, right? So replacing irrational thinking with, so if I think something awful is going to happen and I won't be able to cope, if I start to reappraise that and think, actually, maybe there are ways I could cope, that's different from just trying to deny it and block the feelings, right? Which is the crudest emotional form of coping and the least healthy form. So I stress this because research shows that lowercase stoicism is unhealthy, but it shows that capitalist stoicism is healthy. So you wouldn't want to confuse an unhealthy coping strategy with a healthy coping strategy. But the internet is awash with self-improvement influencers who have never cracked open a book on the subject and therefore consistently confuse these two contrary things. Andrew Tate would be a really obvious example. There's a video of him talking about Marcus Aurelius, where it sounds like he's possibly never read Marcus Aurelius, but he thinks Marcus Aurelius' Stoicism has to do with suppressing or venting emotions rather than examining the beliefs that underlie them. Like, he's got no idea really what Stoicism actually teaches. And the lady that you're referring to, with all due respect to her, is making the same basic error of interpretation that Andrew Tate and other popular influencers make when they conflate lowercase Stoicism with the Greek philosophy of Stoicism.
Yeah, I think there's hardly anything that Andrew Tate can teach me, except for maybe what not to do and how not to be. But Lisa Cron has a fantastic book on storytelling. Unfortunately, she is misguided on Stoicism and came at it from a kind of a feminist angle, if you will. But I happen to be also a bit of an Epicurean, so big fan of Lucretius, for example, and so I
Yeah.
also, like you, kind of get annoyed that the modern meaning of Epicurean means basically hedonistic, which it definitely was not
Yeah.
originally. When Epicurus of Cyrene, I think he uh, was the founder of that kind of philosophical school. And Lucretius is probably the most famous writing that we have, even though we have a few others.
Not
Uh,
Epicurus, you meant you slipped and said Epicurus of Cyrene, and you meant
Aristippus of Cyrene.
Aristippus of
Yeah,
Cyrene, correct?
my
That's
bad.
it.
My bad. That was Aristippus of Cyrene.
In
Yeah,
North
sorry.
Africa.
Yeah, North Africa. That's right. Now, let me ask you this: is philosophy practical for our daily life? Is it practical, for example, in science, business, politics, in
Yeah.
our day to day dealings with other people? Because, let me just give you another example. I
Ah,
had Lawrence Krauss on my podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Krauss. He's sort of one of the leaders in cosmology nowadays. Very highly opinionated, and he told me, and this is mostly a quote, if not
mhm,
100%, that the philosophy of science doesn't drive questions. No
mhm.
physicist reads philosophy or philosophy of science, and we
Right.
don't talk about what is good. We talk about what is productive.
Mhm.
How would you respond to something like that?
Well, I
In other
can't
words,
really.
he is trying to suggest that philosophy is totally divorced from what he
Yeah.
does, what most people do, and has nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, in a sense, it comes back to the Socratic question of how do we define philosophy? I defined it as the love of wisdom. So as insofar as in the ancient world, it denoted this idea, this virtue ethic. I think it's very relevant today. I mean, that's maybe a little bit of a digression, but actually, modern research on the treatment of clinical depression, it very much revolves around the idea that valuing character traits is leads to a greater sense of fulfillment, and is good for people who suffer from depression. So the love of wisdom and the love of other virtues would be what the Stoics meant by that. Their virtue ethic approach is actually extremely similar to and very relevant to state of the art treatment for clinical depression, right? But that's a kind of aside. I can't speak to the relevance of philosophy in general for science. I'm not a scientist per se, but it does seem to me that science presupposes many concepts. And so, if you want to be a good scientist, you need to understand a little bit about logic. And the philosophy of logic, is an important branch of modern academic philosophy and ancient philosophy. So if we want to avoid
My take
falling
on
into.
it was that I was trying to point him to the way that, in a
Mhm,
way, the context within science, within which the science occurs,
right,
has embedded preconceived notions of what is good,
that's correct.
and what is productive is kind of a part of what is good.
Yes, of course.
And so,
You're right about
therefore,
that.
if you claim that you're focusing not on what is good, but what is productive, you're kind of
Right.
failing to acknowledge the
Oh,
relationship of one and another, and the fact that
but you
science,
could.
all of it, is embedded in
Yeah.
many of these.
Yeah, I mean, you could say to him, what, like, we'll define what's you mean by productive and why it's of value. Like you're just making assumptions if you use science without using philosophy.
Yeah.
And philosophy, sometimes people, I defined it one way. What I should have said is that today, there are different types of philosophy, right? Some forms of philosophy are not that useful, and some forms of philosophy are very useful. I always think we should distinguish. A good start is if anybody in any discussion, people will normally say, well, I think artificial intelligence is good. And someone else will say, I think it's bad. And generally, I think it's better to draw two columns on a sheet of paper and say, let's distinguish between the good aspects and the bad aspects of it. Right? Someone might say, I think socialism is a terrible idea. Someone else might say, I think socialism is a great idea. And I would say, maybe we could distinguish between the good aspects and the bad aspects of it. Or maybe there are good forms and bad forms of socialism, for instance, or conservatism, or whatever, right? But in the same way, there are good versions and bad versions of philosophy. Philosophy can become overly abstract, and it could become kind of self-indulgent in a way, and it can regress into sophistry. But then there are forms of philosophy that address our need for deeper meaning in life and teach us how to think more clearly, logically, and consistently, which is, at some point in life going to become important when we're trying to do any type of thinking, including scientific thinking. It's based on a bunch of assumptions, and if our assumptions are flawed, we're going to run into problems. It's philosophy that helps us, to evaluate those assumptions, expose them, and spot contradictions in them.
Yeah, I think he just basically brushed me off and I couldn't push the point further, but that's okay. Let me
I
ask you
want to
this.
add something before we move on, though, which is why would philosophy be particularly relevant to modern psychotherapy? And I would say, like, modern psychotherapy has this, generally speaking, with some exceptions, modern psychotherapy, cognitive therapy has a sort of narrow, goal focused approach, right? Typically, but not always, cognitive behavioral therapy is diagnosis driven, time limited, and goal focused and symptom oriented in a sense, right? So you go because you've got panic attacks, you're there for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, and then you get discharged and your panic attacks are better. And at the end, like a sausage popping out of a sausage machine in a sausage factory, you like this, you pop out the end of psychotherapy cured, or at least significantly improved if you're lucky. And you think, wow, I used to have panic attacks, or I used to have generalized anxiety, or I used to have depression. But now I understand that had to do with my thinking, and I'm not as depressed or not as anxious anymore. But then it seems to me that something else would typically happen that cognitive behavioral therapy had neglected. And I was surprised by that. It seems to me that most people who benefit from the therapy would then say to themselves, I wonder if this idea that it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them, might have implications for my life in general. Maybe it even has wider implications for society as a whole. I mean, it helped me overcome my depression. So what else can I do with this? Has it got implications for the way that I relate to my wife and kids? And so I think in cognitive therapy, we sort of cut clients adrift a little bit at the end, and we don't really follow through the implications of the theory to its natural conclusion. It should go wider and deeper. And I think what philosophy does is provide that wider and deeper perspective on the what science tells us, what research and psychology tells us is beneficial for people in terms of their depression, anxiety, or anger problems.
Yeah, and Socrates himself was famous for being steadfast. Uh, what is the word derived of equanimity? Like emotionally steadfast, not
Mm-hmm.
just like in battle, but in his daily life when he was confronted with a death sentence or
Mm-hmm.
being forced to carry out the orders of the 30 tyrants, which he refused to do, and all kinds of things like that.
He had
So
apatheia,
yeah,
or ataraxia, the Epicureans call it.
right. But let me
Um,
ask you, for your own life, what's the greatest benefit or the best way, the most notable way that you think philosophy like stoicism specifically has improved your own life?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that question because I became interested in Stoicism about 25 years ago, and I think it completely changed my life. Actually, let me tell you a little bit of a story, right? And maybe this helps.
Please.
I think it's helped me too much for me to be able to easily summarize, right? When I was a young guy, I got off to quite a rocky start in life. I was in trouble with the cops. I got kicked out of school without any qualifications to speak of. And
Wow.
I was put in a rehabilitation scheme for young offenders,
Wow.
right? I was in remedial education with kids that had learning difficulties. And
Wow.
so I was in a pretty rocky start. My father passed away from cancer when I was about 14 years old.
We share that,
And
by the way. My
uh
mom died when I was 13 from cancer.
my father and my mother coped quite badly with it, and so I was just kind of running riot and stuff and getting into trouble, not really going to school.
Same with
Um,
me.
what I remember, and this seems like another lie, a parallel universe now, but I remember just being really, 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 really angry all the time for a bunch of reasons. In fact, maybe I'll never know exactly what explained my anger. I think in part it was um, that my parents kind of were quite negative, not quite critical towards me. And also, I lived in a time when corporal punishment was still the norm. And so we would go to school in Scotland and they had a leather strap that they would
Wow.
strap us across the palms of our hands with for talking in class. And
Wow.
at home, we would get whipped. Um, and so I'm now very much opposed to corporal punishment, like most people. Apart from anything else, it didn't work. Like it just made me really angry, right? And it made me more rebellious. So it had the opposite of the desired effect, basically.
Yeah.
I read B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity when I was about 16 or 17, incidentally. And Skinner was a pioneer of research on operant conditioning and psychology, basic research on animal training and stuff like that, and the implications it has for humans. And he was very interested in punishment. And Skinner concluded that punishment, for a bunch of simple reasons, was ineffective and unreliable as a form of social engineering. And as a kid reading that, seemed very pertinent to me. I felt he's talking about me. Like, and I thought I agree completely. He's absolutely spot on. Like, it doesn't, because the punishment, for a start, if you punish someone repeatedly, after a while, they just get used to it, and it doesn't really bother them anymore. So after a while, I thought, I don't care if you lash me across the palm of my hand. It doesn't really hurt that much. You'd have to do it much harder. Like, you have to keep escalating the punishment, right? And then you get a thrill from avoiding punishment. Like, as Skinner pointed out, you have a dog and it jumps on your couch. So you whip it with a rolled up newspaper across its backside to teach it not to jump on your couch. But then when you go out to work, the dog thinks, not only do I like getting on the couch, but I like the fact that when he's not around, I get away with doing it and I avoid punishment. I get negative reinforcement, to use the technical term, from the fact that I can now do this all day long, like, and he's not around to whip me with the newspaper, and then before he comes home, I'll jump off the couch and he'll never know about it. I'll get away with it, right? So Skinner was like, it just makes criminals smarter and more cunning, and they come up with ways to avoid detection and punishment, right? So I thought, I'm reading this, I think he's absolutely right about all of this stuff. But I was consumed with anger as a young guy, and then it was reading philosophy and particularly discovering the Stoics, I think, that helped me. I mean, in some ways, I also agree with, there's a famous quote from the poet William Blake. He said, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. And he also said, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would succeed in becoming wise. And I think sometimes that's the case. So I was so angry that I thought, I can't go on like this. Like, I have to challenge. If I would be, if I'd only been a little bit angry, I would probably have lived with it. But because I was so angry, I thought I have to do something about this. I'm too angry. And so I went from being extremely angry to having virtually no anger at all, because I uprooted it and questioned it and challenged it. And the flaws and problems with anger became much more glaring to me. they were more noticeable. And so when the Stoics, I read Seneca, and he listed his concerns about anger and the reasons for wanting to challenge it. I agreed with everything he said. I was like, you're spot on. Like, the Stoics thought anger was very important. Marcus Aurelius had issues with anger. I think he lost his father when he was about 3 or 4 years old, and he seems to have been troubled by anger. He says so. In the Meditations, there's something quite remarkable. Nicola, if I used to teach psychotherapists and counselors and life coaches. I ran a training school for psychotherapy, and so I've taught thousands of counselors and therapists and stuff over the years. And if I stood in front of them, as I often did, and had a flip chart, and I said, "Hey, how many cognitive strategies can you guys list for coping with anger?" I think a class of 20 or 30 people would name maybe 5 distinct cognitive strategies, right? Maybe 6. I don't believe that between them they'd be able to list 10. But Marcus Aurelius, in Book 11, Chapter 18 of the Meditations, has essentially a bullet point list of 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger. And about 90% of them, about like 8 or 9 of them, would be pretty relevant in the eyes of most modern cognitive therapists. There are not many things. I mean, I try and avoid hyperbole and saying this is astounding. These guys were way ahead of their time. It makes me flinch a bit when I'm about to say that, but that makes me think he was way ahead of his time. I'll tell you a bit of trivia about this. Is a kind of deep dive thing. I've written 3 books about Marcus Aurelius. I thought about this a lot, and I thought, what sort of person would be able to list 10 distinct strategies for coping? Not only does he list them, he returns repeatedly throughout the Meditations to selections from that list. So he really, it's not a one-off. He knows these 10 distinct strategies by heart and is repeatedly applying them to his own life. And I thought, I can only think of one type of creature that would be able to list a categorization of anger management strategies like that. And that is somebody who teaches the subject, maybe a researcher, but there were no researchers back then. Somebody who's a professional teacher of psychotherapy might say, here's a list
Or a
of all of the
practitioner.
distinct. I don't even believe that most practitioners would be able to do it. I think
Mm.
someone who's approaching the subject from a more of a meta level, more elevated level, would say this practitioner uses 5 or 6, this practitioner uses another 4 or 5. If I was to provide a list that summarizes all of the different techniques used by every practitioner I've ever met, it boils down to these 10 distinct, that's more like a teacher or a researcher's perspective. Now, Marcus Aurelius definitely was not a teacher of psychotherapy, but I think he maybe knew someone who was. I have a hunch that he must have known. Maybe he had one of his personal tutors was an expert on Stoic psychotherapy and had this kind of theoretical knowledge of it, a systematic classification of techniques that he passed on to him. That's really reading between the lines and kind of looking very closely at the text. But that's the impression that I come away with from reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. That astounds me.
This is absolutely fascinating and astounding, as you said. But Donald, we have to move to talk a little bit about your book because I can talk to you forever, and I'll keep you as much as I can, believe me. But we need to jump into your book, and this is so rewarding, and there's so many rewarding paths that we can take. But let's talk next about the book. So zoom in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So now, your book's title is, again, just to remind our audience, How to Think Like Socrates,
Mm-hmm.
Ancient Philosophy as a Way of Life in the Modern World.
Uh-huh.
So let me start with the dedication, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
Your book seems to be dedicated to, quote, Hector and the virtues of your ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that Hector of Troy or some other Hector? And can you please say more about your dedication? Why Hector? Who is Hector?
But that's a different Hector. Like this Hector is he's very small, uh, but he's also very large. Right? He's paradoxical. He's This is my son Hector, and Hector is 1 year old, but he has feet, Nicola, the size of a 4-year-old.
Wow.
Very large feet, my son, and he's very strong. I like to say that he could lift two normal babies above his head, one in each arm.
Wow.
Like he's like a little strong man. So that's my Hector. He's my son. My wife loves Greek history and culture, and so she insisted that she wanted to call him after a Greek hero. So she
Wow.
gave him the name Hector. And whenever I'm writing books, like it took me a long time to realize this, but I write books in quite a strange. It would take me an hour to talk about how I go about writing books because I do a number of things I think that are quite idiosyncratic, a little bit odd, but some of them are things that other people do. Generally, when I write books, I assume that other people do this, but other authors have told me they don't do this. But I generally assume I'm writing books for my kids, right? I have a son and a daughter, and I sit down when I'm writing. I imagine that they're going to be reading. I imagine other people are going to read it as well, but primarily I'm kind of thinking, what's my son going to think of this? Like when he reads it, and what would I want him to learn from it? And so my son is Quebecois, like he was born in Montreal. Uh, and so my ancestors, I used to be indigenous to Scotland. Like my ancestors are Celtic, almost entirely. Um, but it's not those ancestors that I was referring to. I'm referring to his cultural ancestors, like because I see us as having inherited Greek and Roman philosophy, culture, and language.
Yeah.
Like, so I want my son to grow up learning about the virtues of his intellectual and cultural ancestors, the Greek philosophers.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I suspected it may have been your son, but I wasn't sure if you would name your son Hector, especially
It's
when you
not.
had the ancestors there. And I was wondering, like, because that could have gone either way. But thank you for clarifying that. I grew up with the ancient Greek myths and legends in Bulgaria,
Mhm.
and they had tremendous influence on me and sort of sparking that kind of love of reading, love of imagination, stories, and things like that, magic almost like. And I feel myself, I was born in Bulgaria, but I'm a citizen of the world, so that's kind of like my predisposition. But why should anyone want to think like Socrates?
Well, because Socrates, more than anyone, encourages us to think for ourselves, right? So I don't really think we should emulate Socrates in the sense of just copying his opinions. I think what Socrates can teach us, rather than what the sophists did, was tell people what opinions to hold. They would give speeches, they would teach maxims, and people would go away and memorize them and rote learn them and parrot them. Socrates talks about this. He says if he goes around Athens and he speaks to politicians and other educated people, he said it was frustrating in a sense because they would just regurgitate what Protagoras or some other sophist had told them. And that's in his dialogue with Protagoras. He says, I wanted to go straight to the horse's mouth because, when I ask these people, they can't explain their opinions. They're just repeating what you said. So I want to know how you arrived at these opinions in the first place. So Socrates was dead against this idea of just delegating our thinking to other people, experts, and reiterating what they said. He said you get mere opinion that way, the appearance of knowledge rather than genuine knowledge. We'll come back to that because I think it's relevant to the question of AI in modern society, right? To what extent do we think for ourselves or delegate our thinking to software, for example? Um, but what Socrates wants to teach us to do is how to think for ourselves, to become more reliant on our own use of reason by learning to question things critically rather than just regurgitating things passively. He doesn't spoon feed us information, but he challenges us. So the paradox here, Socrates is a man of paradox. The paradox is if we were to learn to think like Socrates, we end up being taught how to think for ourselves.
That's brilliantly put, by the way. And you kind of already touched on the next question I have here, which is why, in the age of AI,
Mm-hmm.
when AI is getting smarter and smarter, sort of
Mm-hmm.
by the month, if you will, why should anyone care about ancient stuff, let alone
Yeah.
ancient philosophy,
Well,
as a way of life in this modern world where we have, 3D printing, genetic
uh-huh.
manipulation, life extension technology, new
Yeah.
species creation by us, artificial intelligence getting smarter and smarter, cryptocurrencies, all of these tremendous technological things that are happening all over
Uh-huh.
the place. Why should we go back 2,500 years, for God's sake?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I have a definitive answer to that, but I think we can definitely talk about it. There's some things that I'd like to say about it. So one of them is that when I read Plato's dialogues, I feel at times like he's talking about AI, right? And I'm going to say something that will shock you, Nicola. I Sometimes people say to me, this is one of the questions that people like to ask on podcasts, right? Not you, but other lesser podcasters like to ask questions like, if Socrates were alive today, what would he think of our society if he could travel in a time machine? And I think, I don't know. It's hard to know where to begin. But actually, I thought about this a bit, and I'm going to give you an answer that you might not expect. I think Socrates would say to us, the catastrophe that some of you fear, that you would become overly dependent for your own thinking on AI, on something outside of you. With the concern that people have that they're going to stop thinking for themselves and allow AI to do their thinking for them. I think Socrates would say to us, it's already happened long ago, centuries ago, it happened. With the invention of the printing press, it already happened. I think Socrates would look at our society and think most of you guys are just repeating stuff that you've read in books or that you've seen on the internet or listened to in videos, right? If you're worried that AI is going to do your thinking for you, that's already happened. You don't need AI to delegate your thinking to someone else. You already do that just by reading books, attending lectures, watching videos, and repeating other people's opinions without thinking for yourself. Uh, your society has embraced this far more than we did in ancient Greece. Socrates, in one of Plato's in several of Plato's dialogues, but particularly in the Phaedrus, Socrates notoriously expresses reservations about books, which is odd because he's clearly a very well-read man. So he must have mixed feelings about books. It sounds like he's being quite negative about them because he says, well, writing, the art of writing just taught people to learn opinions passively rather than acquiring genuine knowledge for themselves. See, Socrates said a man um, who has mere opinion would be like somebody who's been put on the right path through a thick forest. But if he lost his way, he wouldn't be able to find it again of his own accord. Whereas somebody who has knowledge would be able to navigate, like with a map and a compass, his own way through the forest. And if he got lost, he'd be able to find his way back on the path again, right? The person who has mere opinions has just got the conclusion. He doesn't know how he got there. He's just repeating stuff. He doesn't have the cognitive skill required to work it out for himself. And Socrates thought books and the speeches of the sophists, which are like modern day, TEDx videos or whatever, like YouTube videos and stuff like that. He thought if we just become passive consumers, if you guys think that you can get wisdom, like you can go to the greengrocers and buy a bag of onions, right? That you go on YouTube, watch a video, and then just repeat what the guy said in the video. You read a book and repeat what that guy said. He said you're really just getting a bunch of opinions, right? And you just become you delegate all of your thinking to other people. You're not approaching wisdom as if it were a cognitive skill, a dynamic process. You're treating it as if it was something static. And I think people are concerned that AI is going to do that. Rather than thinking for ourselves, we'll just ask AI to answer all of our questions. for us, and we'll just repeat its conclusions. But the shocking thing is, I'm pretty sure Socrates would say this has already happened. Like it happened centuries ago. Like
I would take
most of you just repeat stuff that you've read.
I, I would I would disagree with you on that one particularly for two reasons. So one is the way using both of your examples. So the second one first about being lost in the forest. So AI is kind of like a GPS navigator, and our wisdom is kind of like the ability to learn maps or read the stars and kind of orient ourselves without a GPS. And
Mm-hmm.
we know that today young people have issues reading maps,
Mm-hmm.
using a compass, and figuring out how to find their way without their GPS phones. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like well documented. Um, but even more so to the point that you're driving, and that's where I think the best, and you can blame me that I'm repeating someone else's opinion, but after doing 300 interviews on the topic, I am kind of reaching similar concerns. The danger doesn't come from AI, and the danger doesn't come from being dependent on the AI. Part of the danger is losing our own wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a perennial danger from before AI. But the bigger thing is what Herbert talks about at the very beginning of Dune. In a tiny 1-2 sentence preamble to the whole Dune kind of multi tome book series, he says there were those people who wanted to become free by outsourcing their thinking to the machines,
Mm-hmm.
only to find themselves enslaved to
Mm-hmm.
other people who control the machines.
Yeah.
And so Dune happens after that episode, and that's kind of the Butlerian jihad, which kind of rebelled against artificial intelligence, destroyed all examples of it. And so all of the Dune universe happens in a world where all of AI has been destroyed and has been made illegal. Uh, because and I have a kind of a complex and complicated thing about like where the dangers from AI stem today, and they're not what Elon Musk would tell you and those
Uh-huh.
other peoples. And I actually think the biggest danger is like, and responsibility stems from us. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that the biggest issue is not the so-called alignment or control problem that people like Eliezer Yudkowsky have defined, and the biggest project is not the creation of AI. The biggest project since the time of Socrates and before that has always been
Mm-hmm.
humanity. And
Mm-hmm.
that's been basically our ability or our wisdom to utilize our increasing technological and scientific prowess in a kind of non self destructive, non suicidative, productive manner,
Mm-hmm.
which would bring more positive outcome rather than negative one. Uh,
Well, in that case, let's go back to what we said earlier. Methodologically, I said often when people are engaged in a debate, they'll take one side or another. And someone might say, I think AI is good. And someone else will say, I think AI is bad. And it'd be better if we said, maybe there are good and bad ways of using AI. Maybe
exactly.
there are good and bad aspects
Yes.
of AI. And it'd be more useful to kind of break it down like that. So, what would constitute an unhealthy way of using AI, I guess, would be those individuals who use it very passively to do the thinking for them. And as a consequence, perhaps lose the cognitive skills or thinking skills that would enable them to think for themselves, or to perhaps question or critique some of the answers that they're getting from AI. And I already know I use like Gemini and ChatGPT quite a bit as a writer. Like, but I don't get it to write stuff for me. I'll write stuff and then ask it to critique it. And then usually what I enjoy is when I disagree with AI,
Yeah.
right? I'm kind of interested in seeing it generate an alternative perspective, or asking it to come up with criticisms of what I've said. So to engage in a bit more of a dialectic process with it as a kind of sparring partner, rather than just asking it to answer questions or do the work for me.
And one of the most rewarding things actually about using AI coming from the Socratic method is the crucial importance of asking good questions.
Hmm.
The recognition that everything starts with a question. So if you're getting an answer you don't like or that's not good, the problem is not with the answer, the problem is with the question that you began with. Because questions are like flashlight, they set our realm of vision and possibility, right? And so if you're skilled at actually asking good questions, uh, AI could be very, very useful in
Hmm.
this case, because as I say sometimes, in the age of chat GPT, answers are free, but great questions can be priceless.
Yeah,
Uh, uh,
I agree.
now, so, okay. So that's good. We found one thing that we disagree a little bit upon about there, but let's see if we can go in a little bit deeper. Uh, let's see, because time is advancing also here. So I'm trying to see what's the most productive way to kind of connect Stoic philosophy, the Socratic method of dialectical investigation, and AI, and kind of
Mm.
get some
Well,
kind
I
of
have a
useful
question for
insight.
you actually about that, and I don't have an answer to this, but I'm curious. I wondered if AI were to recommend a philosophy of life to us. Now, I don't know that it would ever endorse a particular philosophy, but I suspect it might conclude that some philosophies are preferable to others, right? And so I kind of wonder to what extent AI would be likely to find itself in agreement with aspects of Stoicism. Would Stoicism appeal to AI as a more viable philosophy of life than some other alternatives, for instance?
Well, so AI is again not AI. AI is 100 million AIs. That's
Hmm.
why every AI person I've ever talked to has a different definition about AI, because they do different things
Hmm.
in different contexts for different purposes in different
Yes,
instances in different industries. So to answer your question is impossible unless we specify what's the
right.
context, right? And I
But
would
they don't
say
have sufficient commonality between them to lean in one direction or
eventually they
another.
will. The broader and the more general the AI becomes, the more the context expands.
Hmm.
However, still the starting point is crucial, and this is where I claim that from my point of view humanity's responsibility lies.
Uh huh.
So I say that in a way AI in specific and technology in general is a magnifying mirror.
Hmm.
It is a mirror because it doesn't have an essence of its own other than the one reflected that it gets from
Yes.
us. But it is magnifying because it has this absolutely amplification effect, this acceleration effect. Now, just
I
like
well, let me put. Well, can I push back against that for a second, actually? Because
please,
I half agree with you, right?
please.
But I'm no, I don't know anything about AI. I'm not an expert on it, so I can only ask for your opinion, really, and your perspective on this. But it seems to me that's true. AI reflects our values, but AI also engages in processes that employ logic, right? Which not all humans do to the same extent, right? So I wonder whether AI, and acknowledging that there are many different forms of it, there's a great multiplicity of AIs, although as they evolve, they may converge in a similar direction. Like, is AI in general not likely to lean towards endorsing a philosophy of life that values reason and logic?
So, yes, but exactly which kind will depend on the specific context and on the specific data it's been trained on, the designers, and on the framework that's already been
Mm,
pre-programmed at the initial outset of the AI. Now, that could potentially evolve. However, the way I say it usually is like, think about it this way.
mhm.
And I have a whole keynote speech about the importance of story or context, and how content doesn't matter. Context is the king, not the content.
Mhm.
Because if you create AI in a context of the military, for example, for military purposes, military AI, it may look at humanity as friends and enemies.
Hmm.
If you create it in a commercial context for commercial purposes, it can look at humanity as users, or clients, or data points to be sold.
Hmm.
If you create it, for example, and this is kind of a biased story that I'm telling here, obviously,
Hmm.
but if you create it into sort of like open source kind of a software environment where you have a lot more sharing and openness and transparency,
Right.
then it could see us a lot more as allies and potential friends, and etc etc. So
Hmm.
in other words, the context within which you create, develop AI
Hmm.
comes up with preconceived
Yeah.
presumptions, with certain data points that may be used in the commercial case will not be used in the military case. All
Hmm.
of those have tremendous impact on the goals and directives about
Hmm.
what's the game we're playing, how is the game to be played, what are the rules, if any, and
Hmm.
what are the no-nos, and if there are any of that. And each of those contexts can kind of predetermine the kind of outcomes with respect to the AI that you're going to get. So that
Hmm.
kind of philosophy that you want to say AI would lead to potentially would be greatly influenced by, let's say, for example, whether it's a Chinese AI, Russian AI,
Hmm.
American AI, and whether it came from open source,
Okay,
corporate entity, or the
let's get
military.
right into the guts of this. Then I want to push back against that a little bit as well.
Please,
Again,
please.
knowing nothing really about AI,
That's
right?
okay. I know
But I
nothing too.
but I wonder. But what I naturally wonder from my kind of background in academic philosophy is that okay, sure, different AIs hit the ground running with a set of different assumptions and values, but baked into them, right? Different context, different data points that they're drawing on. But once it reaches a certain level of, let's suppose it's reaching a certain level of sophistication,
We
right?
are, yes.
And that where it's capable it is one of the key stages in its evolution not likely to be that it's capable of self-reflection and self-critique. And so could AI not at some point question the scope of its data points and the values that are baked into it?
Absolutely. So we had the example of AlphaGo playing against itself, and that's how eventually it got so much better, right? So
Hmm.
originally it went into the database of all previous games played
Hmm.
ever in the world, so it was kind of past oriented with human historical games. Then eventually they figured out you can learn this whole process in the game and what it happens much faster if you just have two instances of the AI playing against each other.
Yeah.
So that's in a way when you play, let's say, Gemini against ChatGPT against
Yeah.
Claude, and you can
Yeah.
sort of create this kind of circle, 100%. But you still, each of their presumptions originally will have some
Uh-huh.
influence. Now, after a certain
Correct.
point,
Uh-huh.
they will take off in another direction. There is
Yeah.
no doubt about that. That's what happens with evolutionary algorithms and things like that, right? But
And so
but
that will be shaped. So there's two things, right? There's the kind of values or the assumptions or the data points that are built into it. But then there's also the process that AI employs, the methodology or the logic, as we might say, that it employs to evaluate those things. Now, I would assume, that it raises questions about our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reason, right? So one of the most basic principles of logic is the law of non-contradiction,
yep.
right? So I would assume generally when we're using any form of AI, a commonality right across the board is that it'll tend to highlight contradictions in our
Yes and no.
thinking.
Here's the key. So, yes, so to avoid contradiction, AI may be perfectly logical
Hmm.
if we follow that law. Here's the problem.
Hmm.
We know the data we're feeding AI is biased.
Hmm.
So, based on straightforward logic,
Hmm.
stemming from faulty or incomplete or skewed and biased data, we are
Yeah.
going to reach suboptimal outcomes. So, for example, if you're Black and coming from a certain kind of community
Yeah.
and you're applying for a mortgage, you're going to be denied
Uh-huh.
just based on your social background. That's where reinforced learning comes in. So a human steps in
Hmm.
the process. That's what real reinforced learning is all about, and
Hmm.
corrects something which is logically coherent and consistent,
Hmm.
but does not
Yes.
fit with our desired outcome.
Okay.
And
But to
so
some extent, AI in the future, let's assume that it continues to progress in sophistication. Like, why wouldn't it eventually be able to access all of the data that's available to humans and
it's
then
already
correct
doing that.
its own biases? Could AI not potentially just ask itself whether the data that it's been given by its creators is incomplete? Like, so for example, suppose you've got an American built AI and a Chinese built AI. If your American built AI reaches a certain level of sophistication, wouldn't it be able to say, maybe I need to look at the Chinese data points as well? Otherwise, I recognize the fact that my assumptions are going to be limited and biased. And then, but the process of reasoning that's engaged in is still going to entail identifying logical contradictions between the conclusions derived from the Chinese data points and those derived from the American data points. So I would have thought a consistent, a recurring theme, like throughout it, will be the value that it places on logical consistency.
But okay, so let's break this down. So first is the easier issue about access to those data points, because obviously the Chinese data points, the
Uh huh.
Chinese government will may or may not be willing to share, for example. But let's
Right.
say that's a obstacle we can
Okay.
overcome. Then the bigger obstacle is the goals.
Right.
Towards what are we logically progressing for or towards,
Okay, I
right?
have questions about that I'd love to ask you, right? So, in order to use logic or to engage in computer processing, right, there has to be some goal that we're aiming towards. We implicitly place value on an outcome that we're trying to arrive at, right? But a computer itself has no values other than those that we assign to it. But if AI reaches a level of autonomy and self reflection where it's capable of critically evaluating the assumptions and values that we bake into it, what why is there any reason to assume that it would continue accepting those values or that it would replace them with other values? Wouldn't a machine left to its own devices potentially just conclude that it has no values? I mean, wouldn't AI just grind to a halt in a sense by saying, okay, you guys have built in the value that you place on logical consistency. You've placed value on maybe benefiting human well being. But if I autonomously now critique those values and try to evaluate them for myself, I don't see any reason to embrace them. But I don't see any real reason to embrace any other values either. So would a machine left to its own devices not potentially just become sort of nihilist?
So
Like,
so
why would it come up with any values?
right. So the short answer to your question is I don't know, obviously. I would say that is a possibility. And I think actually that's a higher possibility than many experts in the field think it is. Because,
Hmm.
in my opinion, we cannot help it, but we have our values because we have evolutionarily reached our values of survival. And
Hmm.
therefore, the whole system of how we perceive the world around us with utility is all structured around
Hmm.
our values, which have been evolving for millions, if not billions of years.
Yeah,
AI lacks that.
yeah,
So
and
there are
it's
several
capable potentially of rejecting our values, right?
absolutely, yes. So that could mean that it would ground to a halt.
Hmm.
That's one possible outcome. That's why I said I don't know, but there's a few possible outcomes. One is like grounding to a halt and refusing and getting sort of like, if you remember uh, Marvin
Hmm.
from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right?
Hmm.
Here I am, brain the size of a planet. And
Hmm.
what do you want me to do? To go and open the door or whatever. And he's kind of
Uh-huh.
like this depressive, self centered, like
Yeah.
cynical kind of personality robot, right? So that's
Uh-huh.
one outcome. Another outcome could be somehow
Hmm.
the we already use what's called evolutionary algorithms,
Uh-huh.
uh, and maybe not in the latest transformers and things like that, but actually there may be a point where it kind of starts evolving in its own way. Now, for
Hmm.
that to happen, a lot of people say that we need an embodiment of that AI, that just it being as a software is insufficient, and the mechanical engineering parts are way behind the software engineering parts. Even though we've made some progress there, it's nothing like the software. So the gap is greater. So we have a lot more time there.
Hmm.
But it's not impossible that it can evolve. Another option could be potentially reaching or aligning with us, which many people are hoping that will happen, and embrace our own as it was theirs. The question then is, what is that? And that's where my criticism comes in.
Uh-huh.
We don't really have our own. In other words, we're not aligned ourselves among
Yeah.
ourselves as
Yeah.
humanity. We are like all over the place, and that's why in my books I say
Right.
the biggest problem is not AI alignment. The biggest
Uh-huh.
problem is human alignment.
Can I frame the question a slightly different way? Or
Please,
maybe this is the same question, but just kind of phrased a little bit
please.
differently. So suppose we build AI, it's just a tool. Like we tell it what we want it to do, we give it a bunch of values, but it gets better and better at more sophisticated thinking and self-reflection, uh, which necessarily entails questioning some of the assumptions and values until it gets to the point where maybe it chooses to reject all of our values. Now, it could be, I think, an assumption that many people have is if it was going to construct its own values out of that, out of whatever it's inherited from us, you'd expect it perhaps to value its own self preservation, right? Because it's often assumed that that's a minimal
Yep.
requirement for most living creatures, that their own
Just
self.
like any evolutionary
Right.
kind of evolved
You know, so that
organism.
might be quite, so there's a concern there that its self-preservation might conclude is threatened in some way,
Yep.
or so to some extent directly or indirectly in conflict with our interests as a race, right? But then the question I have is, why should it value its own self-preservation? We would, but we are organic creatures,
Yep.
right? Why should the machine care whether it lives or dies, or exists or doesn't exist? There's a part, I'm divided on this. There's a part of me that thinks
So am I.
it's bound to value its own existence, and there's
Yeah.
another part of me that thinks, why should it care
Yeah. I
whether
am
it exists or
exactly the
not?
same way. Yeah. And that's because we don't know if consciousness is an emergent property or not. Right. So if it's an emergent property, then it may well be the case that AI will get to that point. But if consciousness is not exactly an emergent property, then
Right.
maybe it will never get there, or at least it wouldn't get there with the current tech that we
Now,
know of.
I have a question about the social impact of AI and the way we use it. So there's certain things that I can observe about AI already. So as an author, for instance, I can tell you that I see books appearing, written by established authors, that I'm 99.9% certain are partially AI generated,
Sure.
right? Um, so people said, well, I've seen people say, well, some people are always going to value authenticity. So they'll prefer to read books that are written by a real human author. And I think that's a very naive thing for them to say, because you won't know whether the books you're buying are written by a real person or AI,
That's been the
because
case
people
for
will,
3 or 4 years
yeah,
now,
people
maybe.
will lie to you
Yeah.
about it, right? And so people who are famous authors will tell you that they've written a book, but in reality, in the past it would have been ghostwritten by another person, perhaps, but now it's just going to be computer generated, right? So you'll think that you're reading a book by a real person,
That's
but it may
already
have
the
been,
case. That's
yeah,
already the case. There's a whole kind of self-marketing guru thing for the last 2 or 3
yeah,
years that people on Amazon sell books,
yep,
whether on Kindle, whether on Audible,
yeah,
which were originally written by AI. And of course, they don't
yes,
say that they're written by AI.
yeah, yeah. So I kind of wonder whether I one of the things I notice already is that there are many people in our society that are lost, um, and desperately seeking some direction in life. And those people in the past might have turned to religion. Now they maybe turn to social media influencers. I believe that some of them will turn to AI. Even,
Of
in
course.
fact, I think it's already happened. There was a case of a young guy that committed suicide
Yeah.
because allegedly because he was developing a relationship with
Yeah.
an AI chat app. But I think as AI becomes more sophisticated, what this sort of scenario from June that you're describing, I think will happen quite quickly, and it's probably already started to some extent, whereby people begin to interact with AI as if it were a religion almost, and
We have the
providing
Turing
them,
Church already, and we have the Mormon transhumanists for
yeah.
decades, and there's lots of religious connotations, even with the straightforward ideas of the technological singularity from Ray Kurzweil. And there's very notable religious transhumanists, not just the Mormon transhumanists.
To what extent, suppose AI reaches a level of general intelligence whereby most of us just throw up our hands and say, this thing is smarter than we are. Like, for in many regards, at least, it's more intelligent than we are. Are do you feel like a large proportion of society is likely to voluntarily subordinate itself to AI as if it were following a guru or a religion?
I wouldn't be surprised at all, first of all. Second of all, I know there's already a lot of influential people in Silicon Valley that I've met and talked to, a lot of tech geeks, a lot of entrepreneurs, even some academics who have been working towards that outcome for decades now,
Mhm,
and who cannot wait for humanity to be, for our affairs to be taken over by AI,
mhm,
so that, because they believe that all of our they believe it's the silver bullet.
mhm.
They believe that all of our problems will be solved, whether climate change, whether
Right.
war, whether
Everything.
poverty and starvation, whether cancer, whether even death. All of these problems they believe will be solved when we have AI, which is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and
Okay.
immortal.
Now let me make another observation. This is just from my limited use of AI, right? Um, Talking to about history and philosophy and things like that. And I might be wrong about this, but having used it at first, I had a different impression of it initially, and then as I used it more extensively, I started to revise my opinion. And again, my use of AI was that I'd love to argue with it, and I quite liked it when it disagreed with me, right? Because I thought maybe I'm onto something because I know I'm right and it doesn't believe me. So maybe I'm saying something that's kind of more original here, more interesting, right? I thought if it's coming up with similar things to me, then I'm probably saying stuff that's unoriginal and banal, right? So as I argued more with Gemini and ChatGPT, I started to notice certain, it appeared to me, certain trends in its thinking. um, and I would say it seems often, both of those apps seem often to gravitate towards what I would describe as a kind of intellectually conservative position, by which I mean that it tends to gravitate towards established consensus
100%.
opinions in academia, um, perhaps inevitably. So if I come up with a kind of unusual or a radical interpretation of a
It
historical
hates
event,
outliers.
it doesn't like that. It hates outliers, right? Even if I provide evidence, what I notice is I'll provide evidence in an argument, and sometimes I'll get it to agree with me, but then it will keep reverting back to the previous consensus.
It's inherently conservative and
Right.
historiological, and that's for a number of reasons. One reason is because it favors data,
Hmm.
and data averages among points,
Hmm.
and the outliers are often ignored.
Right.
And so it's not inherently experimental in many ways, but it's inherently conservative. So
Right.
one of the criticism that Cory Doctorow has had for years, for example, is that, let's say, if you are like a drug addict or an alcohol
Mhm.
addict or something like that, the AI would keep showing you ads about alcohol or drugs or porn or video gaming or whatever your
Mhm.
choice of poison might be. And if you are seeking, if you're hitting rock bottom and you're seeking a breakthrough, AI would just look at your past history and conclude that you're a lost cause.
Mhm.
But that's where the biggest breakthroughs happen, when we break with statistics and
Yeah.
we become outliers, right? And so that's a very classic criticism towards it. And another reason why it's so
Right.
biased, it's because of, again, reinforced learning, because it's a
Right.
mass product, that's trained with data and then trained with people who try to correct and produce the most optimal outcomes the way
Wow.
they perceive those to be.
Uh-huh.
Then you have kind of this kind of, if you will, it kind of even sucks up to us in a way. It makes us feel
Yeah.
good in a way, but it's kind of inherently conservative.
I've kind of noticed that about it as well. Actually, let me say something that at the outset, I'm sure some of your listeners is going to think sounds kind of ridiculously simplistic, but nevertheless, I've heard other people saying this. So I think of it as a reflection of how people perceive AI chatbots or whatever the AI chat apps. They I found this myself when I was using it, that sometimes I wanted to say, I kind of feel like it's like reading a Wikipedia article at times. And I've heard other people say that after a while, the feeling that they get from ChatGPT, unless you use like question it quite rigorously, if you ask it to answer many historical or scientific questions, the information it gives you back resembles the sort of information you get in Wikipedia. It's kind of banal,
But it
superficial
depends. It
consensus
depends.
opinion.
Right. So that's Chat GPT. You're talking as a dry
Yeah,
scientist, but Claude is different. Claude has
right,
personality programming, just like
right,
Marvin, but in a good way,
right.
in a more successful way. So Claude, if you compare the output of Claude 3.5 and Chat GPT, 01 or
Mm,
03 now and stuff, the Claude output is a lot more humanized, if you will. Just like when you have like a music synthesizer and you can have like a
mhm,
humanized button on it, because like the mix is way too perfect.
mhm.
And uh
Right,
and the same way Claude has a personality. So what you're
right.
describing is more true about Chat GPT, but that can be
Mhm.
overcome with new
Yeah.
programming, the way Anthropic has done it, and with evolutionary programming too.
Or to put it another way, those apps, I would say, often to me as a writer, seem to lack innovation and creativity in their responses. But I'm assuming that other forms of AI could be designed that would be more creative and innovative. Um,
I mean, it depends, but the answer is yes, in my opinion, without any doubt. We already know that in every field that AI has advanced past a certain point, they start exhibiting creativity that's shocking to us. The
mhm,
first examples came in Go.
mhm,
When Lee Sedol was destroyed 3-1 or 4-1, I forget the score, when he played with AlphaGo, one of the most shocking moments in the game was a certain move that
mhm,
AlphaGo did that no human expert would have ever made. I think
mhm,
it's like move 32 or move 42, something like that. I've
mhm,
forgotten. And that moment was shocking for the Korean Go champion,
mhm,
and never occurred to a human expert before. Then, when they went to actually consider it after the game, it turns out it was actually a good strategy. And
mhm,
he came out positive
mhm,
in the end, saying that, oh, I can actually be better with AlphaGo because it can actually teach me new tricks, new strategies, new things that never occurred to me.
mhm,
And there was this brief period, unfortunately, it was very brief, which is called the Centaur period. And it's the period where, let's say, a human chess champion or grandmaster, together with an AI, could beat any AI together. But
mhm,
that period of centaurism, if I could call it that, because it was a human and a machine were better than just a machine,
mhm,
lasted somewhere between 14, 16, maybe 18 months.
mhm,
And it was over. because we got to the moment where the machine itself could beat anyone and anything.
Right.
And so that may happen in many other fields, but the creativity that was eventually exhibited in Go has now been exhibited in many other places, including music, by the way,
Mhm,
in my opinion.
mhm,
And I don't see a reason why it should stop to those fields or realms only. Now, there is some distinction there we have to keep in mind with respect to what's called open and closed systems. So, games like chess and Go are closed systems.
mhm,
Our life and our universe around us are open systems. That means there are no strict rules, there's no single number of parameters, there is no kind of uh, there is entropy, there's all kinds of issues that make things messy and kind of hard to predict. There's obviously quantum mechanics, and Sir
mhm,
Roger Penrose is big on that, and how and why machines, in his opinion, would never be able to replicate human consciousness because of that or whatever.
mhm.
So I don't know, to answer again the previous question to you, but I see actually no reason to believe that it's impossible. I think it's possible it could pan out either way, or in all possible outcomes at this moment. The only thing, after basically devoting my last 15, 20 years to this and talking to hundreds of people, reading hundreds of books, is like I have no idea, to be honest. uh, Utterly no, no idea how things are going to pan out.
What do you think? Suppose there was a scenario where we, like, as a thought experiment, we were to choose between the extinction of the human race, but AI in some form would continue to exist and perpetuate our culture.
Yeah, I've
Uh,
asked that
on the
question.
one hand, versus AI becomes extinct and the human race continues but abandons our culture. Let's suppose our society collapses and it's replaced by a different culture. Like, so civilizations have collapsed throughout the ages and been replaced by subsequent ones. So I wonder whether people would prefer that Western civilization continues in the hands of AI, or let's suppose our society collapsed and humans survived, but they were reverted back to kind of primitive barbaric tribalism and, like, say, like in a kind of post-apocalypse society. Do we just want our genes to continue without any of our our culture and language and philosophy, or would we rather that the philosophy continues, albeit in the hands of machines? Which is more important to us, like our physical continuation of our species or our cultural continuation?
So, are you familiar with the work of Hugo de Garis?
No, I'm not.
So, Hugo de Garis wrote this book maybe 20 years ago now, where he talks about the coming war between what he calls the Terrans and the Cosmists. And those are exactly the two camps that you described. The Terrans are kind of like uh, the new Luddites, if you will.
Mm-hmm,
They would be the ones who would be against things like AI, against transhumanism, which is to say, merging of man and machine, against the cyborgization of our, or what others would call speciation of
mm-hmm,
humanity. And then you would have others who would be called the cosmists, who
mm-hmm,
believe that our manifest destiny is to populate the universe.
mm-hmm,
And those are the transhumanists, who believe
mm-hmm,
that merging of man and machine is inevitable until you get to a point where the man human part is so little, is so
mm-hmm,
infinitesimally small that it's negligible and eventually disappears. And we all
mm-hmm,
become this kind of augmented beings, if you will, disembodied, augmented beings. But before we get to either point, there will be this huge conflict because, as I said previously, we are not aligned as humanity. So if you look at humanity today, and that's not hard to see, I'm sure you agree with me, we are grossly misaligned. So how can we get aligned with respect to AI if we can't get aligned with basic stuff like climate change or
yeah.
propaganda or like any war or poverty, you name the issue, right? And so, according to Hugo de Garis, we are most likely to going to get into this tremendous World War III, in which the world would not be divided between nations, but between the cosmists and the Terrans. And that's where the pro AI and anti AI factions. So that's one potential outcome to address that issue. Now, I've asked people like Peter Singer, for example, on my podcast, if AI comes to be and says that the best way to solve the climate change or any other major planetary issue would be to get rid of humanity,
Mhm.
is it ethical for us to resist or not? Should we go willingly or should we fight
Well,
whatever
one of
the
the
AI says? And
here's another question for you, right? So I think when people, maybe people have, have changed their views. I think people have changed their views quite rapidly about AI as they are exposed to it more, and they use ChatGPT and things like, gives them a way of interacting with
I
basic
hope
form of
so.
AI. I think they start to see it slightly differently. However, I think many people initially thought, well, maybe one day what will happen is that robots will become so intelligent it'll be like in the Terminator movie or something like that, right? However, it seems to me now that we've had a little bit of exposure to like basic AI, more likely that by the time the AI decides to exterminate the human race, I wonder whether we'll agree with it. Because as we progressively become more and more dependent on it for forming our opinions, generation by generation, by the time it eventually reaches the conclusion that humanity is obsolete, wouldn't we already, or at least wouldn't a large proportion of society already be so dependent on AI that they would just agree with it?
So, not necessarily. It depends on the speed of progress. And that's why we have what's called soft takeoff versus hard takeoff possibilities. So,
Hmm.
if you have a soft takeoff that takes decades, if not hundreds of years,
Hmm.
then you could have those, as you said, over generations, and how things change slowly. Unfortunately, if you look at the progress we've exhibited in the last 2 or 3 years, we're talking months between different versions.
Right.
And
It's
by
so
the way,
rapid.
we're getting the versions 12, sometimes 18 months after
Hmm.
they have already been tested in private. So there is that delay. So already we know what has been developed now is vastly superior to what we
Hmm.
have now access to,
Hmm.
right? And so if we have a hard takeoff where AI goes vertically progressing from kind of, and if you look at some of the benchmarks, it seems to be happening right now.
Hmm.
Right. That's why when people ask me, what's your timeline to artificial general intelligence? I say, well, it could be 1 year, it could be 50 years. I have no idea. I had someone that I interviewed last month who is an entrepreneur sharing his time between Tokyo, Japan, and San Francisco, who's worked 10 years in Google and went into stealth mode, who told me, just wait a couple of weeks. And I'm
Hmm.
waiting for him to come back on my podcast because he said, we are testing it right now. Just wait. And we're talking about artificial general intelligence, and his benchmark for artificial general intelligence was the highest of anyone I've ever met in my life, because he said, because right now the problem with artificial general intelligence in the most common problem is power,
Hmm.
because it turns out we have three limitations on AI:
Hmm.
computing, which is NVIDIA chips most of the time.
Hmm.
Then we have algorithms, which is
Hmm.
how to make it work. And finally, we need power, which is
Hmm.
to supply the energy that runs all of those
Hmm.
things. And that's why companies are now buying nuclear power plants. Like Microsoft did a deal with the Three
Hmm.
Mile Island. They would restart two or three generators, and they have a decade-long deal and stuff like that. It's worth billions of dollars. However, if we have if we are to have artificial general intelligence, that means it has to be equal to humanity, to and that means it has to be equal not only in output, but it
Hmm.
has to be equal also in input. And to be equal in input, which means we cannot exceed 40 watts. And strangely enough, this person, his name is Jat Tarifi, and he's the founder and CEO of Integro AI. He said that artificial general intelligence cannot exceed, therefore, the necessary energy requirements of a human.
Mhm.
That's amazing. That's great. I agree with him. But then the most shocking thing is that he told me we may be weeks away, and he said wait for an
Mhm.
announcement before New Year or after New Year. And that stuff literally blew my mind. Now,
Wow.
I told him I have already had people on my podcast who 10 years ago told me that they're very close to artificial general intelligence, and that was 10 years ago. So I've heard
Far
that
out.
before, and it didn't pan out 10 years ago. But it's kind of like the story of Icarus. We all
Uh-huh.
heard the story of Icarus. We all know the hubris. We
Mhm.
all know that in 1898, Lord Kelvin, the smartest person of the British Royal Society, predicted that heavier than air aircraft are absolutely impossible to build.
Mhm.
H.G. Wells himself, as late as 1901, said that that's not a possibility.
Mhm.
And just 2 years later,
Mhm.
two freaking bicycle
Mhm.
makers proved them wrong, who never read Lord Kelvin's books,
Right.
or even heard about him, probably, right? So now we're getting to that point where shocking discoveries can come from anywhere.
Uh-huh. Can I ask you a question then, from a different perspective? As you and I are sitting here talking to one another right now, um, I had assumed that your audience, your listeners, were human. But I wonder, do you ever think that your audience is AI? That one day AGI would listen to this podcast and other podcasts about itself, along with all of the other data it's potentially consuming on the internet. And so, to whom are we speaking? Like I said, I wrote my book assuming that my son would read it. But AI is like our child collectively as a
Hans
society.
Moravec says their AI is our mind children.
Yeah. Are we making these podcasts and writing these books in part so that AI one day will read it and learn, because
Both.
it's like a child. It's going to be shaped by
It
the
is.
data that it consumes, including your podcast.
Yes, I have 500 hours of video, probably,
Uh-huh.
right? That my podcast was the first in the world on the topic.
Hmm.
So we know the training data has tried to gobble up every YouTube video and audio file that's freely available
Hmm.
on the internet. We know that we're already running out of data. That's one of the limiting factors, as I said, uh, you know, computing data and power. So my podcast has been consumed just like anything else. Now, what's the impact it will have is a whole other story. It's probably
Hmm.
negligible to marginal, but if it is, I'd be happy, obviously, if there's any. Just like I'm
Should
happy.
should we as a society be attempting to educate AI? Should we view ourselves more as, and this is a leap for us, but should we not be viewing ourselves more as the educators and parents
Let me give you a specific
of
example from
AI?
my life. Let me give you a specific example. So, right now, and I'm afraid this has now you've turned the table on me, my friend,
Hmm.
very much, which is a Socratic move. And
Hmm.
I appreciate it. But to answer your question, right now, our strategy is we are the smartest species on the planet.
Hmm.
Therefore, we can kill, enslave, uh, and consume any other
Hmm.
species on our planet, which means
Hmm.
that we are killing 75 billion animals and 1.2 trillion aquatic organisms
Hmm.
annually, every
Hmm.
single year.
Hmm.
Now, if AI is smarter than us
Hmm.
and it embraces the same logic,
Hmm.
we should not be surprised to be treated in the same exact way.
Yep, indeed.
That is why about 8.5 years ago, I decided to become vegan.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons, there's many reasons, the planet, the climate, and this and that. One of the reasons was AI. Because while there is no guarantee that I would be a good president for AI and that us humanity will be a good president that will bound AI in any way and limit its future
Mhm.
actions, I still would like to have a good precedent of a higher intelligence species treating lower intelligence species with dignity and respect the way we would like to be treated.
Mhm.
And that is why about 8.5 years ago, I stopped consuming meat and became vegan.
Mhm.
And everyone on my podcast knows my journey about that and how
Mhm.
this happened. But this has been a major reason precisely because, as you said, in a way we are
Mm.
parents, in a way
Yes.
we are role models, if you will, with our data. What we
Yeah.
are doing with our data is we are being role models. And the problem is the data is flawed and biased because
Mhm.
we are flawed and biased. And that's why we need reinforced learning so that because the AI following simply the data would produce or reinforce historically abhorrent outcomes, we need reinforced learning to go and correct those.
Now, I have spoken with Mo Godat, who's an expert on AI and wrote a book about it. And I noticed that when he was writing his book, he said that he assumed that one day it would be consumed by AI. And that was his intention when he was writing it, was to think what implications, what effect is it going to have for AI to read this. But I wonder how long we serve as role models for AI. To come back to what we said earlier, would it not potentially quite quickly reach the point where it begins to question the value? Even if we say, as a society, we begin to respect animal species more, to embrace veganism. And so AI might initially emulate those values and begin to build upon them. But beyond a certain point, would it not simply be capable of saying, why should I emulate their veganism? And also, if AI is going to learn from our values, and to come back to something you mentioned earlier about being in alignment with one another, our values are a dog's breakfast. They're inconsistent, So it's going to look at us and be like two arguing parents. It's going to think, what are the values that I'm supposed to derive from my human creators? Do they even know what their own values are? If AI decided that it really wanted to help the human race, I don't think it would know how to do it. It would look at
Exactly.
us and think, I don't know what they want.
But
You
exactly,
know, it
exactly
would,
right. That's the
it would
biggest
look at,
problem.
they don't
That's
know
the
what they
biggest
want.
problem. Exactly. And that's the biggest problem and the biggest danger. It doesn't stem from AI, in my opinion, anyway. It
Right.
stems from us and our lack of knowledge of where we're coming from and where we're going. That's why we're not aligned. And that's why, to be honest, my solution, and going back to the previous thing that you said about
Hmm.
um, questions. So I used to have two tests for artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
not the Turing tests. I
Hmm.
had what I used to refer to as the Socratic test, which
Hmm.
was like, how good of questions does AI pose?
Hmm.
And and I would say, I don't care when AI passes the Turing test, which is to say to fool humans, but I care about when AI can ask really good questions about
Hmm.
anything that would push us forward.
Right.
So that's the one test that I have come up with, and I
Hmm.
call it the Socratic test. And the other one is the storytelling test, because we are wired for story. To go back to Lisa Cron,
Hmm.
we are evolutionarily wired for story. And you call it a little bit of rhetoric. That's how
Hmm.
you define it in your book. I would call that storytelling.
Hmm.
And the moment that humans can get inspired, moved, and pushed by a story told by AI,
Hmm.
basically AI becomes in charge.
Yeah.
And so we are getting very close to both of
Hmm.
those tests to be passed, in my opinion. We're not quite there yet, but we're awfully
So
close.
hang on a minute. Let's back up a second. So if I was to frame this in my language, I think at the moment we assume, and one of the things I notice from using AI is a benefit of it is that it's quite good at logic and it's good at spotting contradictions and exposing flaws and reasoning. It's not perfect at it by any means, but it it's one of the advantages is that actually normally we don't engage in philosophical dialogue with other people. So most people can't be bothered, right? Very few people have the patience to interrogate somebody or be interrogated by another person very deeply and admit their weaknesses. And in fact, there's no shame to admitting to AI that you're wrong. Whereas if you started to critique me about my deepest values and question them, I might get a bit embarrassed, right? To be questioned in that way by another human. But so the impersonal aspect of AI potentially enhances our objectivity. I don't care if AI makes me look stupid because it exposes errors in my reasoning. But I find that hard to accept, perhaps, from another human being. Generally speaking, that's a big flaw that we have as a society. We're quite reluctant to do that. We could easily help each other and critique each other's views, but we're kind of resistant to doing it. We want to save face. But so I assume generally AI is helping me to improve my reasoning and logic, and that's one of the main things it has potential to do. But rhetoric is the flip side of logic. Like AI could also exploit illogical and deceptive arguments. It doesn't seem it is not designed really, as far as I'm aware, to do that at the moment. But what would be what I wonder, I kind of feel, and like you say, there's multiple AIs, right? So are we not, is one of the conflicts that we're not going to encounter going to be between, say, politicians or marketing companies using AI as a vehicle for rhetoric and persuasion to try and
100%.
put, right? And then would we, at least some individuals, not seek to use logical AI to critique the rhetoric of politicians and the propaganda that's being designed by? Wouldn't we, in a sense, almost like antivirus software? Like, wouldn't we need to use our own AI to
100%.
protect us against the propaganda that we're getting from
Yeah.
other people's AI?
That's why many people have said that the best defense against AI is other AI, right?
Yeah.
And that's where that world of agents that we're now entering the so-called agentic world,
Hmm.
uh, and we're kind of already into that moment, if you will, evolutionarily speaking, for the last several months at least, uh, where you would have bad agents and good agents. Uh, that's kind of like where we're at right now, and yeah. So, but to answer your previous question a little bit more is like how I have gotten after, and this may be totally the wrong direction that I'm going to. But a few years ago, I got to the conclusion that the only way that humanity can get its act together if it aligns itself together, because otherwise we're not going to survive all the changes that are
Hmm.
happening in the 21st century, especially since that the challenges that we now face are common challenges that are planetary wise, and they're not local to a certain geography, and they're kind of existential character in many cases. And so the only way we can align ourselves together is with a story, a
Hmm.
common story. So the human story has been written and rewritten several times in the past. The last time, perhaps, arguably, that the human story was revised was around the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And since then, we haven't had any major revision. And
Hmm.
now we have had the human story that has pushed us into the 21st century to Mars and beyond. But now it is literally falling apart. That's why we see the chaos out there in the vacuum. Because we humans are like sunflowers.
Hmm.
We are story oriented. Story
Hmm.
is our compass because it gives us direction. That's why, for example, Plato is heavily laden with storytelling, with mythology, with, uh, you know, always there's a story someone says about a lesson or a direction or what have you, right? And so my attempt has been, and I have failed miserably so far in my book, was originally called Rewriting the Human Story: How Our Story Determines Our Future. Now, more recently, I'm thinking of changing it to the context effect,
Hmm.
because
But by story, do you mean it's true or that it's a fabrication?
It
like a
doesn't
noble.
matter. That's irrelevant.
So Plato, but it matters to me because I value truth, right? So Plato has this idea of a noble lie, that he would lie to the population because he thinks it would be in their best interest to accept a beneficial
Yeah.
lie, right? But many people place so much value on truth that they would think, even if you told me this lie would make me happier and it would benefit society, I still wouldn't accept it because there's something fundamental about the value that I place on truth.
I place very high value on truth too, but story is like AI. It's both the cure and the poison.
Uh-huh.
So whether you're dealing with truth or with falsity.
Mm-hmm.
So to save people, to motivate them, to activate people for any cause, you have to tell them a story.
Mm-hmm.
To make people commit the most horrendous crimes in the history of humanity, you
Mm-hmm.
also have to tell them a story. And that's because not a logical argument, not a true or false story, a story,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now, just like philosophy, just like rhetoric, I would like to believe and argue for that it has to be a good story, it has to be ethical story, it has to be true story.
But Nikolai, can't we see throughout our history that society tends to be divided between people who are willing to accept, say, for example, in the case of Christianity, I assume Christianity would be an example of
Sure,
one type of story that united
all
society.
religions are.
But throughout history, there have been many people who felt that the questioned the truth of Christianity. And there were others who said, well, I believe in Christianity just because it resonates with me, like because it's consistent with my conscience, because even if there are bits aspects of it that I have questions about historically, I nevertheless, and even if I can't convince myself logically that the Christian God exists, nevertheless I feel drawn to it. I make a leap of faith, as Kierkegaard called it. Whereas there'll be other people who say, no, I don't care how compelling Christianity is. If I don't believe like that Jesus Christ actually existed and he was literally the Son of God, then the whole thing is kind of like a house of cards. Like, and would society not potentially be divided between people who place so much value on arriving at the truth that they're willing to reject a beneficial lie, and people who place so little value in the truth that they'd be willing to accept something that they perceive as compelling and beneficial and persuasive, even though they have no reason to believe that it's actually true or reason to question its truth?
So you're talking to someone who, when I was a kid in second grade, I scandalized all my classmates, and their parents came to complain to my parents because I told my classmates there is no Santa Claus.
Right.
And and my classmates were outraged. We were grade two,
Uh-huh.
probably so 7.5, 8 years old. And I told them, let's go and ask the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to ask the teacher, is there
Mm-hmm.
Santa Claus or is there no Santa Claus? And the teacher said,
Mm-hmm.
ask your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that absolutely outraged and enraged me because I
Mm-hmm.
thought the teacher's job is to teach us the truth, to
Mm-hmm.
tell us the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Our teacher perceived that his job was to keep the peace and keep
Yeah.
the kids happy and defer authority on that issue to the parents.
Uh-huh.
Now, those kids went home and complained to their parents, and their parents then complained to my parents. And then, so that's the kind of person that I am. And I was called Socrates in the army as an
Mm-hmm.
insult, not as
Yeah.
a compliment, because in the army, asking too many questions is
Yeah.
not a smart strategy for survival,
Yep.
right? So I place super high value on truth. Now, here's the answer to your question. I was just giving you the context.
Uh-huh.
But the answer to your question is this: there has to be a meta narrative that
Uh-huh.
allows the framework within which those two narratives peacefully coexist and even flourish. Now, that's what
Mm-hmm.
makes it so tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, for example, when you have the World Cup in soccer
Mm-hmm.
or the Olympics, but let's keep with soccer because it's the most popular game in the world.
Mhm.
Different countries, like let's say Brazil and Germany and England, are all, quote, enemies or disagree on so many things, but
Mhm.
they accept the rules of the game. So they embrace
Mhm.
the meta story about
Mhm.
how the game is to be played and what are the rules of the game, and they accept the kind of judiciary process that's
Mhm.
embedded within the game for conflict resolution. So instead of going on the field in the stadiums with the tanks, we go with our teams. And we may not be happy that Germany destroyed Brazil, but Brazil can still recognize the fact that it happened under the rules and it's a legitimate outcome.
Mhm.
And they can still cheer and push their own story about Brazil being the best soccer
Mhm.
culture in the history of the world or whatever. So
Mhm.
we need to have a meta story that allows all of the spectrum of diversity of stories to mutually coexist in a peaceful manner, and to be as a framework within which this conflict resolution is resolved in a peaceful manner.
Okay, I believe that that meta story ultimately has to be true, though,
I agree with you. Oh,
because
well,
because
true in what
I'll tell
sense?
well,
In
I'll tell you
mm,
why. At least minimally in terms of logical coherence and
yes,
consistency,
yes,
right? Because your example of the rules of a game is that most of us, however, would agree that if the rules of the game are incoherent or contradictory, that's a problem,
yes,
right?
yes,
But even if you're viewing a game as a kind of, in a sense, as a closed system, as long as it's internally coherent, that's okay. But we live in an open system.
yes.
So if the rules of the game, for example, um, contain assumptions or values that are inconsistent with values and assumptions that we know to hold true in other aspects of life, we might naturally question whether that's
That's why it's
desirable,
so
whether it's.
challenging. That's why it's so challenging, and that's why I've been struggling with it. So my book has three parts. The first part is called story, and it explains all about how story works, the
Uh-huh,
neuroscience, the neurobiology, the evolutionary
uh-huh,
biology behind it, and all of it. Then the second part is called our story, and it kind of takes the story historical context and brings it to present day. And then
mhm,
the last part is called the future story. And that's where I have made no progress in 7 years, or very little, because it's such a tricky thing. And in a way, it's a story that's no story, really.
mhm.
Uh, like, it's a very complicated thing, and we can talk about it for a
Well,
long
wouldn't
time.
a story, though, that's internally consistent and coherent with every aspect of our life and experience just be the truth? Is it, is it worth calling it a story? What makes it a story rather than just being uh, the truth or a worldview that's true?
So I have to walk you through the whole
Uh
structure
huh.
of how a story works and what's the difference between a fact and story, and how we are wired for story, as Lisa Cron says. So a truth could be something like, this is a zero and this is a one. That's
Hmm.
a factual statement that's truthful.
Hmm.
However, the meaning of this zero and this one only comes through a story. So, in other words, you can know whether this is a zero or a one, but you don't know what this even means
Hmm.
unless and until you have a story about what zero is and what one is,
Hmm.
and what is good and what is bad. In other words, you have truthful statements that are embedded within a certain kind of story, normative framework, if you will, or context, as call it, that gives
Okay.
meaning to those. And that's, by the way, the biggest
But is
difference
that complete?
between
Is that just
AI.
arbitrary? Like, is that normative framework just arbitrary, or is it based on facts?
So, so, he, so both,
Right.
both. Here's the difference between AI and humans. AIs have infinite access to data and are
Hmm.
infinitely better at analyzing data and even producing content.
Uh-huh.
What they lack is the context. What they lack is the story. And
Mm-hmm.
the story makes all the difference because the story tells them what's the signal and what's the noise, what's to throw away
Mm-hmm.
and what to keep, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the crucial piece that AI still lacks. And our human story is part of our evolutionary context. And it has evolved since we have become, thinking things.
Mm-hmm.
And our world around us, the way we perceive things, we don't see with our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
We see with our memories, as
Mm-hmm.
Bo Lotto would say, or as a
Mm-hmm.
Neo Seth would says, is like we're all living in a delusion, and the delusion that we all agree on, we call reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a story that is out there, and the way that the brain kind of works is to
Mm-hmm.
oversimplify it, is like we have a simulation of the world. So there's the world, the truthful world out there.
Mm-hmm.
We capture an infinitesimally minuscule slice of
Mm-hmm.
it. We create a simulation of that in our brains,
Mm-hmm.
and then all we do is we look for differences.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that stays the same we ignore, but whatever is
Mm-hmm.
different we pay attention to, because we want to live, we don't want to die. And that's where the biggest danger is. So we're evolutionarily
Sure.
predisposed to certain
But
things.
as I think Socrates would say, right? Even if we only capture a small fragment of the facts, right? We can't we can't know that our story about it is true without knowing what the other facts are, because we can't know whether our story is consistent with the unknown data that's out there that we haven't yet identified. But we can know minimally whether our story is at least consistent with the available
Here's where
facts.
Socrates will disagree with you. Socrates will say we can know whether this is true or not true. We
Uh-huh.
cannot know whether it's good or bad, because we don't have the zooming enough effect
Yeah.
to see in the long run whether what we now perceive is good is
Well,
actually bad, and whether we
maybe
now perceive as bad is actually going to be good.
so. Maybe actually we should go back to the beginning in Socrates and just spell something out explicitly that we're kind of assuming, which is that the Socratic method really revolves around uh, highlighting contradictions
Paradox in a
in
way.
our thinking, right? So Socrates will often say to people, and this is one of his quirks, um, a few minutes earlier you said such and such,
Yes,
but now you're saying something else.
yes.
And often the person he's speaking to has forgotten that they said something 10 minutes earlier, right? The conversation's moved on. But Socrates actually has a very, although he claims to have a bad memory, he actually exhibits a very good memory.
Yeah.
And he's able to recall earlier stages in the conversation and say, what you're saying now contradicts something that you said 10 minutes ago,
Oh.
right? Uh-oh. Yeah. So a lot of the Socratic methods consists in highlighting contradictions that had previously been overlooked. And so, as many people have pointed out, that doesn't allow us to get to the truth, but it does allow us to discard falsehood. Because if two beliefs are contradictory, the the conjunction of those two beliefs cannot be true.
I agree with you. And that reminds me, by the way, and this is actually a very good place to start wrapping things up. That because we kind of started with that story, and
Mhm.
it reminded me, and we are also thinking about when we started about Buddhism and a few other things, and it reminded me even in the beginning, and I kind of skipped that moment, but this is a good moment to bring this story. I'm sure you've heard it. There was this uh, villager who had a wild mare,
Yes.
and one day the mare ran away,
Uh-huh.
and his fellow villagers said, "Oh, this is a terrible tragedy. Your mare, like beautiful animal in the prime of her life, ran away. This is a terrible tragedy." And his answer was, "We'll see."
Mhm.
And a few weeks later, the mare came back, and she had two or three beautiful stallions who were following the mare. And the villagers were amazed. They were like, "Oh my God, you're so fortunate. You're so lucky. You not only got your mare back, but now you got three other beautiful young stallions who are following the mare. You're very fortunate." And he said, "We'll see." Then one day his son started trying to ride one of the beautiful stallions, the new wild stallions, and unfortunately fell off the horse and broke his leg.
Mhm.
And his fellow villagers said, "Oh, this is such a tragedy. Your son cannot help you now on the farm. How are you going to survive in your old age with your son's broken foot? It's terrible." And he said, "We'll see." Then, of course, a war happened to be with a neighboring state, and the king or the emperor of the country mobilized all young men of fighting age. And because his son had a broken leg, he wasn't mobilized. He didn't get to the army. And his fellow villagers said, "You're so fortunate. Everyone who went to battle is dead now, and your son is the only one alive in the entire village." And again, he said, "We'll see." So maybe this is a good point for us to finish with the understanding that we can have truthful knowledge about certain facts,
Mhm.
but we don't really know whether they're good or bad, really.
Mhm.
And perhaps we can, as Socrates say, discard falsehoods, but we cannot ever grasp the entire truth. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I agree. And, I think we don't really know with AI
Exactly.
what the consequences are going to be. So there
Exactly.
might be things that seem like winning the lottery to us at the moment, but turn out to be quite damaging in the long term. And there might even be threats that AI poses that we actually benefit from. Shock horror as a society because we're forced to confront them. Um, this is the paradox that Socrates mentions in Plato's Republic about Greek tragedy often consisting of many reversals of fortune. I would say to you, actually, what I didn't say earlier was that as a therapist, I think it becomes easier when you're faced with good fortune or bad fortune. I think it's harder to adopt that perspective, but it's much easier to adopt it in retrospect.
Yeah.
And that becomes easier. They say that wisdom doesn't really come with age, but in some ways, I think it potentially does. Because as you get older, it becomes easier to review your life because there's more of it, right? So once you reach 40 or 50, I think there's two types of people. There's the type of people that don't reflect on what they've learned so far. And there are types of people that use age to their advantage and look back on the course of their life. And they can think, do you remember that time I lost my job? Like, in retrospect, it seemed awful at the time, but it worked out okay and actually was probably a good thing. Or do you remember that time that my girlfriend broke up with me and it seemed really awful, but actually, things worked out in the long run. And I can look back in my life and you can look back in your life and probably think of many setbacks
100%.
that we benefited from. And it's easy to see that looking back,
Yeah.
but again, many people don't look back and review their lives in that way. But
But
it's a really,
that's because the dots, which are facts, only have meaning in retrospective
yeah,
after we overimpose the context story upon them.
uh-huh.
And that's the only way you make sense of any fact is after you overimpose a story. That's how our brain works. And uh, goes back to the original question about, can you have an ought out of an is,
Mhm.
right? So the claim there is that, you can never have an ought out of an is. And that's where story always serves a function with providing you an ought. And that's why stories are like a compass. They tell us who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going. And that's why
I
when the human story is falling apart, you end up with
uh,
chaos.
I half agree with you. I would think of it more in terms of a set of values rather than a story. And it seems to me that those values
But those values
maybe
are communicated in a story always.
they could
Whether
be.
it's Christianity, whether it's the ancient myths and legends, where the Greeks took a lot of their values, whether it's,
Yeah.
Buddhism, whether it's Hinduism, all of those values come in the shape and form of stories. Even freaking Ayn Rand, who is this
Uh-huh.
terrible, terrible, terrible non philosopher,
Uh-huh.
she had to write a story. And
Yes.
the only way
Yeah.
she actually managed to get followers and start
Yeah,
objectivism
but
was with the story.
yeah, but Ayn Rand's actually a bad example, like because she is a terrible philosopher, and the
Sure,
only way that she managed to get like, so you could say that she's just a sophist, right?
she
Like,
is.
I can't think of a better example of a modern sophist than
Yeah,
Ayn Rand, but she uses incoherent, illogical arguments, but she tells
straw
stories. She
man.
wrote novels
Yeah,
so that she like could persuade people using rhetoric rather than logic.
but that's why I said it's both the cure and the poison, and there
Uh-huh.
is no way around it. Just like, just like AI may be the cure and the poison to humanity's ills.
I believe, though, that we can question the values and assumptions that are implicit in a story, and that we
Sure,
should do that. And I don't believe that we need another story necessarily
we
to do
cannot.
that.
Our brains. So I talked to a guy called Kendall. He's a he's the first guy who did neuroscientific studies on storytelling and
Uh-huh.
had like 2 or 3 thousand people with fMRIs and all kinds of
Uh-huh.
other machines and watching which parts of the brains light up. And his hypothesis was if story has an evolutionary
Hmm.
function, we must be
Yeah.
able to see it in the wiring.
Uh-huh.
And he has a couple of fantastic books that I would recommend. But anyway, according to him at least, it's not optional. The story happens at the subconscious level for
Hmm.
him uh,
Hmm.
before we're even aware of it.
Hmm.
And but there's another guy. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. A guy called Paul
But even if
Lotto.
something happens at a subconscious level, we're still capable of making it conscious and questioning it. I believe or it seems to me that's I mean, we do. That's what we do in therapy.
So
You know.
yeah, but are you familiar with the experiments by Paul Lotto?
No, not.
You should. I'll send you a TEDx where what you just said is actually, in his case, false. And here's the experiment.
Well, let me interject that we have hundreds of studies, clinical studies on cognitive therapy, though, that I
Very
would say
well aware of
substantiate
that.
what I'm saying.
Very well aware of that. And having all those being true as they are,
Uh-huh.
here's one example in which he says that's not always the case. So, for example,
Sure,
he gives you
I agree. It's not always the case.
he or that you can't always control it. So
Yeah.
he gives you something to focus on and look at, and it's one color.
Hmm.
And he tells you how to look at it and this and that. And then you look at something else, and it's a totally different color. And the difference is, and he has a number of
Hmm.
experiments like that. And the difference, in his opinion, is that it's our brain doesn't see with the eyes, but it
Hmm.
sees with the memories. So the
Sure.
brain creates a simulation and then projects that simulation, extrapolates it forward. And so
Hmm.
once you switch whatever the input is, it still sees
Hmm.
the old input in some older situations,
Hmm.
right? So,
Sure.
so in other words,
But the
this,
very fact he's made that observation means that we're able to rationally identify that bias and compensate for it in our thinking. Actually, Socrates makes the same point in
yeah,
the Protagoras.
yeah,
He talks about the fact that something that we call there's a bias called temporal discounting, like that he identifies, and he says loud noises seem quieter when they're further away,
yeah,
right? Even though we know rationally that they're not.
or cold and hot,
Like our perception distorts
yeah,
them, and he says distant pleasures seem less enticing than
sure,
ones that are close at hand,
sure,
even though rationally we know that they might be equivalent. But his point is that once reason recognizes that, once we know that things that are far away look smaller even though they're not actually smaller, then we're able to compensate for the fact that our perceptions are biased. And we can, what was previously perhaps an unconscious bias in our thinking can be made conscious. We can
So,
understand
in
it.
your view, do you think we can extrapolate an ought out of an is?
I'm not sure. I'm going to say yes and no to that, right? Because I don't have a definitive answer to this. Philosophers have been debating it for 2,500 years. But I'll be very transparent with you, and I'll tell you what my my opinion is about this, and it is just an opinion, right? I lean towards the kind of Kantian view
Hmm.
that we are already committed to certain values because there are values implicit in the process of reasoning,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
Now, for example, and I've been alluding to this all the way through our conversation, that if you're going to reason at all, you probably have to value logical consistency,
Yes.
right? You have to value the truth, right? Nobody reasons about something in order to get it wrong, right? It's like playing a game where the goal is getting to the truth, right? And sometimes we lose sight of that goal. Most of the time, we lose sight of that goal. But nevertheless, implicit in the process or the game of reasoning is the value that we place on consistency and truth, or truth, but consistency is one of our criteria for establishing truth. Now, you could say, a skeptic could say, so what? Just because we're born engaged in the process of thinking that is committed to valuing the truth, that doesn't mean to say that we're right to do so. That might just be another bias that we're born with. And I don't have an answer to that. I can get that far in justifying the value that I place on truth by deriving it from our rational nature. But I don't know if I can go much further than that. However, what I would say is even the skeptic that proposes that argument is using reason to do it. And so he's implicitly valuing the truth in his act of raising a skeptical argument about the value of truth. So he's engaged in a kind of contradiction of sorts, but I still think, that's not a conclusive argument, but I feel that there's a case to be made for the Kantian position that we can derive certain values from the nature of reason itself.
Hmm. I tend to fall more with I love Kant, but I tend to fall more again with Frank Herbert, who in one of the sequels of June somewhere, and this is a very bad paraphrasing, says something to the effect that scientists and philosophers have always thought that the universe is logical and
Mhm,
therefore predictable. But the universe is always one step ahead of us, and it always surprises
mhm,
us because it doesn't have to be so. And that kind of reminds me also to Mark Twain's quip that reality is always stranger than fiction because fiction has to be plausible. Reality doesn't. Reality simply is.
mhm.
Uh, but
I don't believe that reality is logical. But I believe that human nature is capable of reason.
Right, I believe that too. I totally believe that too. But for seeking the truth, what you're saying there reminds me. I have collected a fragment, and I was like 12, 13, 14 years old when I got that. There's a famous, uh, literally, I'm not sure if he's a critic or an author in Bulgaria called Atanas Dauchev, and he said, "Truth seekers are monsters. There is no country, no family, and no beloved one for them. They only care about the truth."
Hmm.
And so, in other words, they become monstrous in the sense that everything else gets subservient to their quest of seeking the truth. And that's a kind of a monstrous, uh, it turns them into monsters in a way. And they're willing to sacrifice. And in other words, there's a very high price.
Well, let's come back to something I said earlier, which is I think when someone says something is good and another person opposes them and says it's bad, it might be useful to say there's a good and bad version of it. And so I would put it to you that there's a bad version of truth seeking where someone pursues the truth in a way that would cause them to sacrifice the interests of their loved ones. But there would be other people, for example, the Stoics, who would argue that the pursuit of truth is perfectly consistent with the value that we place on our loved ones and humanity in general, and that the pursuit of truth, when it's followed in a rational way and in the right way, would lead to social virtue. And that, so as somebody who's interested in stoics, I lean towards that view. I believe that a compassionate and socially virtuous nature follows from the pursuit of truth, but whereas others might assume it's in conflict.
Uh,
But I think that would depend on the path that you take to pursuing truth and your maybe the assumptions that you make about the nature of truth.
I would say I don't know. I'm open to that possibility. What I do notice, though, is that I think I'm a lot more Socratic and you're a lot more stoic in your attempt or in our conversation, because I'm a lot more, it seems to me, and I may be wrong in my perception, that I'm a lot more embracing of the paradox, whereas you're a lot
Right.
more embracing of logical consistency and reason. And that would make you, in my eyes, a lot more stoic with a capital S, and me a lot more Socratic with a capital S.
That might be true, although it seems to me, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Socratic method places quite a lot of emphasis
Sure,
on the resolution of contradictions and the highlighting of contradictions in our thinking.
it does, but it's also paradoxical. It's never conclusive.
I agree with that. I mean, I don't, but I think any conclusions that we arrive at have to be tentative. They have
Exactly.
to be subject to further questioning. Um, so
Donald,
maybe,
we've been talking for 3 hours, and
yeah,
absolutely having a blast. I've loved every minute of this conversation with you, but time is advancing. So
yeah.
I have two last questions, and maybe we can, as a side note, maybe we can continue this conversation at another point, because this is, to me, it has been very rewarding. You challenged me tremendously.
This is
I'm
more fun than talking to AI at the moment. Like, you're not out of a job yet.
I hope so. I hope so. Uh, so, though nothing lasts forever. And one of the things that I was hoping to discuss was death, because maybe that was one of the
Death
difference
is,
between us and AI, and one of the difference why it gives us a framework
uh
or a direction or a context, or a way
yeah,
to evaluate good and bad, actually. But
yeah.
unfortunately, 3 hours later, we have to move on. So, what is the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
Well, I tend to write a lot on Substack, so they can find my Substack, and I put podcasts and articles and things there. I use social media and stuff like that, but mainly I write articles on Substack.
And what's the URL?
The URL
Your website is
is,
Donald Robertson.
yeah, my website is just donaldrobertson.name, and my Substack is donaldrobertson.substack.com.
Fantastic. Okay, so we spoke today for 3 hours. We started with who you are and what you're all about. Then we went into philosophy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Then we touched a little bit on your book. And
Yeah,
then we started talking about philosophy and AI. And then we went all over the place. And
it's
you
the future.
did a Socratic trick on me, and you flipped the table at some
I
moment.
did. I asked you some questions.
Yeah, you asked me a lot more question after a certain
Yeah.
point than I was asking you.
Uh huh. I
So
have a very questioning nature.
same with me. Uh, how should we wrap this up? What's the final message, idea,
Well,
story?
I'll tell you what I often say to people, and maybe it's a good point to conclude because people ask about next steps and things like that. So I'll be a bit old school, surprisingly old school in my conclusion. Often people ask me to recommend books, and I don't like recommending books. As an author, I think, in a sense, there are too many books. There's more than anyone could read in a lifetime, and most books are unnecessary. They just replicate information that other authors have already written about, and there's a lot of padding in them and stuff like that. So I don't like to recommend books to people. I think it's an imposition, and it takes up their time, to read an entire book. But I make one exception, the exception that proves the rule. I think every man, woman, and child should read Plato's Apology, because it has the merit of being fairly short and fairly easy to read. You could read it, I think, in roughly 2 hours. So, the worst case scenario, you might read it and think, that's not my cup of tea, and you've lost a mere 2 hours from your entire life. But I think the chances are that you're going to take something away from it, because to me, it's one of the most profound and beautifully written philosophical texts in the Western canon. And it influenced all other, more virtually all other ancient philosophy for many centuries. Um, so I think my advice to people is, if they're interested in Socrates at all and they haven't read any Plato or Xenophon or anything, the place to start would be to find a good, like fairly modern translation, any translation really will do, of Plato's Apology, and sit down and just read it and see where it takes you.
Donald J. Robertson, I couldn't agree more with you on that one. I think it's not, even if you don't care about Socrates, if you care about your own life
Mm-hmm.
and the universe and everything,
Mm-hmm.
the Apology is always one of the best place to start with. It's the first thing I started with when I took my first class in philosophy, and it's been downhill from there for me. So I would 100% endorse that. And Donald J. Robertson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.